Okay, everyone, I'll reconvene the meeting for today. Our next presenter is Chuck Zuckerman, representing BC Wildlife Federation. Chuck, you have 5 minutes, and when you have 30 seconds to go, we'll signal so you know it's time to wrap up, and then we'll ask you some questions.
Outstanding. Thank you so much for allowing me to attend here. I'm glad to see that everybody is nice and healthy and we're back in business again. And I'd like to begin by saying that I do not envy you your decisions and the deliberations that you have to make. I do budgets with my own organization and they're quite challenging at some times. I went through the budget and fiscal plan this morning that formalized in April 2021. And I enjoy the ethical, responsible spending that you have when you develop your expense categories, 4 health categories, 13 people categories in business, and reconciliation category. The thing that kind of brought me to a bit of a stall was the provincial debt at $87 billion by the end of the fiscal year, of which it's $11 billion higher than projected at the beginning of the year. When you extrapolate that out during using the statistics that are in that report, it's quite possible, if we're $11 billion off again for the next 3 years, that by the end of 3 years, we'll double our debt. And doubling a debt in 3 years is very troublesome and problematic. Also, what I'd like to talk about is Flinrod, forest lands, natural resource operations, and rural development. The BC Wildlife Federation, as a conservation organization, is interested in putting more animals on the landscape, fish in the waters, protecting the environment, worried about climate change and habitat, as well as access. Since the 1970s, there was an increase, it's very mild, in the amount of funding going to the Fish and Wildlife Department originally. However, right now the budget forecast is to start withdrawing funds, and therefore it's going to be 41 million this year, 30 million next, 4 million the following year, to almost a 10% reduction over 3 years. So we're concerned about that funding. The BC Wildlife Federation has 43,000 members, and vital issues to us is natural resource management and wildlife sustainability. Unfortunately, wildlife management agencies have a history of being understaffed and underfunded. Our province's motto is splendor without diminishment, and that's what we embody, and that's what all British Columbians have in their hearts when they go out into the wilderness areas. To give you an idea about, we have the most biodiverse jurisdiction in North America, yet when it comes to funding, we spent in 2017 only $37 million on fish and wildlife, while the state of Idaho, 1/5 the size of BC, but 1/3 the population, spent 3 times as much, $106 million as compared to $34 million. This reduction in inadequate funding results in the mountain caribou being an endangered species, as their herds have declined throughout the province. The Chilcotin and Thompson River steelhead face imminent extinction. Annual returns easily of that particular species are estimated to be less than 50 fish per river system. Prior to the slide in 1914, the salmonoid return was 120 million fish. So we're down to less than a fraction of a percent over that. In the last decade, mule deer and elk populations have experienced severe declines, and the moose population declined almost 70% throughout the province. Then in addition, yes, ma'am.
Pause for a minute. What?
Can you just,
Okay.
Okay. Sorry,
Sure.
just wanted to make sure that we all actually got to hear you.
Yes. No, that's fine. And I also sent a written submission of what I'm saying, so you'll be able to refer back to that as well.
Okay, so continue.
Continue on. Okay, yeah, I see. I'm getting near my end. So the recommendations that we have, the first one is to establish a wildlife governance and funding model following the Premier's mandate to improve wildlife management and habitat conservation in collaboration with stakeholders. The second recommendation, to establish a minimum of a $200 million permanent water security fund that would develop appropriate watershed scale and collaborative partnerships, modernize watershed-based land use developments, and develop innovations supporting province-wide advancement. Your children and their children depend on you to make the right decisions. We need collaborative coalitions for fish and wildlife and habitat. We need to start a conversation of conservation. Ultimately, the solutions of today must not exacerbate the problems that we will face in the future. We can change the future, and we can fix those problems by providing adequate, stable, and continuous appropriate funding now for the future. I think that kind of brings me up to my time.
That's great. Yes, thanks, Chuck. And now we'll ask you some, the committee now has an opportunity to ask you some questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Lauren.
Give you a little bit of a chance and a little extra time to make up for what's happened here in this meeting. My apologies for that. And I certainly hope Pam is okay. You talked a little bit about establishing a couple of different funds. The $200 million fund that you're talking about, where did you get that number from? Where does the $200 million come from? And I can appreciate, by the way, all of the damage that you referred to. I represent Caribou-Chilcote, and I know that we have diminished stock in steelhead. We've got problems in our caribou herd, and we've got Fisher are now red listed. So very serious issues in our ridings. So I just wanted a little bit more background about that $200 million.
Thank you for the question. When you go back to the budget and fiscal plan, a lot of the revenue that comes from the water extraction resource industry goes to general revenues, is not developed back into the security fund that we're talking about. So if just that revenue was deemed to be directed at a watershed funding model, then it was be locked in. So in other words, it's sort of user pays, and that was where that comes from as a beginning. Often you find that when you can define to the public exactly where the money is going and what it can be used for, then they're more than apt to add more money willingly. So there might be a tax on recyclable bottles of water, those little 750 millimeter bottles of water. They're very chic to have, but what happens in the recycling industry? Is that used, or do they go to the dumps? How much does it cost to recycle it versus just send it to the dumps? So perhaps if we paid more for the bottle itself, that might help. That might be dedicated back to the watershed refunding. And then in the watershed, we also would then take a look at the forestry management practices to maintain those watersheds, because now instead of clear cutting, which is not quite, they take away the old growth, leave the shorter growth, and then they take all the limbs on the trees and put them on the ground. That's what enhances the fire situation that we have, and we don't have adequate money to fight the forest fires. Usually we're about 30% less than, in fact, what's paid. So it's a whole integrated climate, environmental perspective that we're asking that the committee takes a look at, and do not silo the separate issues and the separate answers. There has to be a comprehensive way of looking at it, and that would be the beginning to tie things together, would be dedicating funding models.
Thank you, Chuck.
Megan.
Chair, and thank you for your presentation and for your patience with our slightly chaotic start.
Not at all, ma'am.
So my question is related to your paper submission. I read that, and I see that your first recommendation is related to a governance funding model. And what I'm wondering is, you mentioned setting objectives for habitat, fish, and wildlife in legislation. Can you expand a bit on that? I know that there's objectives, as I understand it, are set through various means. But what does this look like to you? Recommendation number 4 of that on page 2.
Okay, this recommendation was set objectives for habitat, fish, and wildlife in legislation?
Yes, that's correct. I
Great.
just wondered
Thank you,
if you
ma'am.
used that a bit.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Are you asking from the budget and the funding point of view, or the general management point? Well, okay, funding point of view. So we have the Columbia River Basin, and the Columbia River fish go up through the Columbia system, cross the border, come into British Columbia. We've built a number of dams along those river systems. Some dams work, some dams don't. There's disabling of dams, the activation of dams going on now. In the United States, they spend almost $550 million, and they represent 2/3 of the Columbia Basin. $550 million. Here in Canada, we're spending $50 million. Therefore, we're exceeding the amount that we're paying for. In fact, so quote, we are getting a good deal. But when so that would be one of the places that in fact deserve more funding on the same scale as they have in the United States. That's just comparing apples to apples, as it were. The objectives for habitat, fish, and wildlife legislation would talk about the preservation of what we have now in terms of numbers, and further recruitment and restoration of the habitat and the numbers of animals that we have. So when you go back to traditional numbers, moose, let's say, there is not a word in the First Nations language for moose, because prior to 1900, there were no moose in our province. There were huge fires that existed at the Yukon-BC border. Those fires lasted for over a year, and then they came through the undergrowth, much like in coal mines, and came to the surface again. But with those fires, they cleared enough area in the timber for the moose to then migrate south. In fact, in BC, you have the Alaska Yukon moose, the Andosoni moose, Canada moose, and in the southeast part, we have Shiraz. Those numbers then in the Bella Coola Valley increased to the point of being, 50, 60,000 moose. And if you compare to Sweden, again, 1/3 the size of us with 2/3 the population, they harvest over 3 times as much moose as we do. And that's because of proper habitat management, resource extraction management. So by going towards the inventory and the numbers of animals, whether it be the land-based animals or the fish, that would be the target that we want to achieve and maintain. And therefore, it's going to be the sustainability. When we talk about First Nations, FSC, they have food, ceremonial, and sustenance purposes. Therefore, conservation is the overriding concern. But that's in the federal dictate of Section 35 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We don't have something similar in British Columbia. British Columbia, again, becomes siloed. There's a regional manager for each of the 8 regions in British Columbia, and they all have different perspectives on how to manage their landscape. The thing is, they don't have enough funding to do it. Sometimes it's a by gosh, by golly, guesstimate as to the number of animals that are on the landscape. For fish, you could have counters in the streams, and they can count the fish as they come back to spawn. But there's nothing like that for the animals. Therefore, we have reporting of animals that are harvested by BC hunters, and then you have the anecdotal reporting that comes from other hunters and gatherers in British Columbia. But where would be the targeting? So these objectives, in consultation with First Nations and groups such as my own and scientists, you could come up with what can the habitat, oh my goodness, what can the habitat sustain, and what's it going to be to meet the needs of society? So, and that would be a whole discussion as to where to go. But what we're trying to do is look from the end result and then work our way backwards. It's not enough to have a fight over who's going to shoot the last moose. That doesn't do anything. The point is, let's increase the environment carrying capacity to have hundreds of moose, and then designate it to the needs of different parts of society.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chuck. We are going to have to wrap it up now. Again, we apologize for the disruption. We tried to give you a bit
That's
more
okay.
time to
Thank you.
account for that. This is a much bigger discussion than can take place in what amounts to 10 minutes. Your knowledge in this area is very impressive, and I hope that we have an opportunity to have further discussions about how we can better protect all the aspects of wildlife in British Columbia. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'll have my communications director get a hold of you, and if each of you could spare some time, be more than willing to get together and have a conversation as long as you're available.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And good luck.
I'm just... Thanks. So our next presenter is Tom Green with the David Suzuki Foundation. So, Tom, thanks for joining us. You have 5 minutes to make a presentation. We'll let you know when you're at the 30-second mark, so you know when to wrap up, and then we'll ask you questions.
Sure, sounds great. Thanks very much. So thank you for the invitation to participate in this process on behalf of the David Suzuki Foundation. What brings me here today is the need to align BC's budget with the accelerating climate emergency. All British Columbians were touched this summer by the devastating effects of heat domes, wildfires, and more. We are now confident through advances in climate attribution that human emissions of greenhouse gases are exacerbating extreme weather events. They will only get more serious and more frequent unless we immediately take climate action. 3 years ago, BC responded with Clean BC. However, with goalposts of what are needed shifting rapidly with new science, this climate plan is no longer sufficient. So here is where we believe BC needs to focus its budget. First, adequately fund Clean BC's implementation. And that means following the advice of former World Bank chief economist Nicholas Stern, who said that governments should be spending about 2% of their GDP on climate mitigation efforts. Second, strengthen and implement missing elements of Clean BC. Implementing the remaining 25% of Clean BC plan without delay is crucial, as is strengthening existing climate policies to reflect the emergency situation we face. For instance, the timeline in BC's ZEV, Zero Emission Vehicle Mandate, needs to be accelerated. Third, stop supporting fossil fuel expansion and forestry practices and investment in LNG export facilities that will further destabilize the climate. The International Energy Agency stated this year that no new oil, gas, or coal projects could be built in the world if we are on track to stay for limiting heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the IPCC issued its Code Red for Humanity report this summer, confirming that humans are unequivocally responsible for the climate crisis because of fossil fuel dependence and massive deforestation. Our expectation for the roadmap to 2030 is that oil and gas sector emissions be immediately capped today. They must decline steadily in line with achieving the sectoral target, the 2030 target, and ultimately to net zero by 2050. But we also need to take into account the fossil fuel footprint, or the carbon footprint of the fossil fuels we export, which in 2018 were 2.5 times BC's emissions. So end all fossil fuel subsidies, financial incentives, and other provincial support by 2022, and support workers to transition away from fossil fuel industries to clean energy opportunities. The contribution the oil and gas sector makes to BC economy is too carbon intensive and is misaligned with achieving 2030 targets. The sector is 3.45% of BC's GDP, but 20% of our carbon pollution. And according to a Stand Earth report, these subsidies amounted to $1.3 billion in 2021 in British Columbia. And 5, stop accelerating climate risk and focus on nature solutions. A report this year from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that's a mouthful, IPBS, makes it clear that conserving and restoring nature are essential to solving the climate emergency and global declines in nature. So we'd recommend that Budget 2022 allocate the necessary funds to ensure 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems can be protected by 2030, support and invest in Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, fund restoration of natural ecosystems degraded by industrial activities, and issue a moratorium on industrial logging of all old-growth forests, which are critical sinks, and allocate funds for the old-growth strategic review. So thanks again for your time and attention, and I hope the urgency of the climate emergency is reflected in the Budget 2022.
Thank you, Tom. Now I'll open it up to questions from the committee. Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tom, for your presentation. Whenever there's numbers, it makes it hard to write down what you're trying to hear. So some of my numbers are sideways. So if you could just explain the number that you used near the end, the 2018 fossil fuel export was 2.5 times. What that made reference to.
And we'll also be doing a written submission by the end of the process. So you'll have all the numbers and footnotes and so on. But if you look at all the coal, natural gas, and oil that we export from the province, so mainly coal and natural gas, and you account for the emissions when those are burned in other countries, that's 2.5 times the carbon footprint of all the emissions we have in this province.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Tom. And I look forward to your written submission because it was a lot of information that was put across. But I guess the main thing about it is that you talked about the numbers that Mike just brought up about the exports, et cetera. And I'm assuming that when you say coal, you're talking both metallurgical coal as well as other exports of non-metallurgical coal and oil and gas. Is that correct?
Yeah, and BC is mostly metallurgical coal.
That's right.
Yeah.
So just in terms of what's the solution for turning the metallurgical coal and the temperature it achieves, et cetera? What's the alternative to that? In terms of an alternative to being able to produce the products that metallurgical coal is used in?
Yeah, no, those are great questions, and it's an area of a lot of research right now, and some pilot projects, such as in Sweden, where they're going for zero-emission steel. Yeah. So different alternatives are being considered, including green hydrogen is one of them, so other ways of achieving high temperature processes. So there's also using electric furnaces and avoiding the use of a fossil fuel as well. And so there's different pathways that are being evaluated. And actually one of the top researchers in that area, Chris Bataille, is associated with Simon Fraser University. So he's the kind of person we often turn to understand what those pathways are. But those windows are now opening up to different ways of doing things. And one of the points we would make, I guess, is that BC has to start to anticipate that world where the world won't be wanting metallurgical coal anymore, because there will be other cleaner pathways that can fit within our carbon budget.
Yeah, I do think that, of course, it's a huge transition, and if you don't plan for it, you don't really kind of arrive at the point where you have solutions as to how you're going to do that. And I didn't know that there were solutions being worked on right here in British Columbia by that gentleman, Chris, you mentioned from SFU. I guess in terms of the overall opening comment you mentioned about LNG, et cetera, and having spent some time in Asia and seeing how terrible the air quality is and their choices, right. I guess what I'm kind of, do you support the transition from the products they're using with things like LNG, or is that just not an option in your mind?
The idea that LNG would be this bridge fuel, I think, has less and less credibility as a climate solution, as we understand, for instance, that BC's methane emissions are about twice what's reported in the official inventory. So there was research that came out this summer. Also, the problem with LNG is often it can be actually displacing renewables rather than coal. So it's not necessarily going to replace coal-generated electricity. Like, I agree, we need to get shut down coal-generated electricity across the world as quickly as possible. It's one of the major contributors to global emissions. But we can leapfrog that. And the IEA now reports that solar PV, solar photovoltaic, is the cheapest source of new electricity in most countries around the world now. So prices have dropped so dramatically over the last 10 to 12 years that that is one of the solutions. And then we've seen remarkable advances in wind, in battery storage. And we actually have a project where we're modeling that for Canada called Clean Power Pathways, which we'll be releasing next year. So that's more a domestic thing, but we're seeing the same kind of things where these new technologies are able to give clean electricity reliably around the clock, even though the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So, Tom, I want to thank you for your presentation. I, for one, will be reading your written submission very carefully. As you point out, we have lived through a summer in which it has come home to roost.
Yes.
And we need new, more powerful solutions. And we need partnerships. As a layperson, I need to educate myself. I think we all feel like we need to educate ourselves so that we make the right decisions as government. And we really value the work that you're doing and the work that the David Suzuki Foundation is doing. It's really important.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the chair and members.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, although I know we're running a few minutes behind, could we please take a 5-minute recess, just as I'm supposed to go into another meeting?
Yes,
And we
yes.
just need to figure out where everyone's
I think
going to
we
be.
should do that.
If we could please do that. Thank you.
So we will now recess for about 5 minutes to regroup. Michael, will you come to the table? So, Michael, I apologize. We're a little bit behind now. You've been very patient. We're in the process of dealing with a medical emergency, but I think we have it somewhat under control, and we certainly don't want to in any way limit your opportunity or anyone else who comes after you. We don't want to limit your opportunity to make your presentation. So for the record, I will say our next presenter is Michael Bissonnette with the West Coast Environmental Law, and you have 5 minutes to make a presentation. We will try to give you a 30-second warning when it's time to wrap up, and then it will be open to the committee to ask some questions. So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, my name is Michael Bissonnette. I am a marine lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, and thanks a lot for having me today. And I hope everything's okay, and completely understand the disturbance. Today, I'd like to speak about the importance of allocating funding in the 2022 budget for the development of the BC Coastal Marine Strategy, which is something that this government committed to this past November. West Coast Environmental Law has been working with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, championing this strategy, a coastal marine strategy for British Columbia, for about 3 years now through the Blueprint for the Coast initiative. And we are very pleased to see this work being prioritized by this government. But that being said, it is really important that this process be supported in the 2022 budget. And so I'd like to begin just to talk briefly about why this is so important and why it's needed right now. So BC's coastal communities and ecosystems right now are facing a multitude of unprecedented challenges up and down the coast. Some of the most prominent challenges right now are things like the climate change impacts, which are going to be leading to sea level rise, flooding, ocean acidification, all things which communities are trying to prepare for. We're also seeing, unfortunately, catastrophic declines in salmon. We're seeing loss of coastal habitat. And related to those issues as well, we're seeing a lot of the local economies in many small coastal communities that are really struggling right now. And if you put COVID on top of that, it's a very difficult situation. And so that's why a British Columbia coastal marine strategy is so needed right now. British Columbia is one of the last coastal provinces or states in North America that doesn't have some kind of unified coastal strategy or law that directs its management and ties it together. Instead, right now, we have decisions being made on the coast through a number of different ministries and departments, but they're not always necessarily working in concert, and there isn't necessarily a greater vision on how these decisions will work together and the goals that we're seeking to achieve for our coastal management. Thankfully, the province has recognized that it needs to address these challenges, and what it has chosen to do so is to develop a BC coastal and marine strategy. As I said, BC is one of the last provinces to have developed one of these, and one of the upsides of that is there's a lot of examples around the world that we can look to. And based on the success of coastal strategies in other places, we know that a BC coastal marine strategy really has the promise to truly revamp coastal management and also to meet many of the foundational objectives of this government. And so just to give you a few of those, this is an opportunity to ensure coastal communities have resilient, sustainable local economies so that those who rely on the coast for their livelihood will be able to do so for generations to come. A few years ago, it was calculated that ocean-based activities in British Columbia contributed more to the BC economy than either forestry or technology sector. So this is a significant sector that really deserves government attention. This is also an opportunity, and these two go hand in hand because the environment and the economy are not opposed. They need to work together. This is an opportunity to ensure sustainable ecosystem-based management of our coastal and marine areas. And last but not least, this government has committed to developing this with Indigenous nations and other orders of government. And this is an opportunity to co-create it with Indigenous nations and to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is something that this government has made a commitment in law through statute. But in order to do so, and that's why I'm here today, it's really important that we make sure that there's sufficient funding allocated to this process. Long-term funding is really what's going to be needed for this. If we really cherish our ocean and ocean economy, we need to make sure that we're properly funding our management program for it through our coastal strategy. And so some of the things that we certainly need funding allocated for are first to make sure that the body who's going to develop and implement the coastal strategy has the funding it needs to do that process. Given that the government has committed to co-creating it with Indigenous nations, it's also going to be really important that there's funding to make sure that Indigenous nations have the capacity not only to be engaged in this process, but to partner with the government to make this a success. And lastly, coastal stakeholders and coastal communities especially are really going to be needed at the table and to be part of this process because they're our key stakeholders on all of this. So I come here today, submission is that we really need funding allocated in the 22 budget so the strategy can start to be developed now and implemented during this mandate. Coastal communities, ecosystems, are really an integral part of BC, and I think it's an integral part of British Columbians' identity. And a strong marine coastal strategy will ensure that BC's coastal areas and the communities that rely upon them have a sustainable ocean-based economy that can support them and that they're able to continue their livelihood for generations to come. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. And the last thing I will say is we do intend to submit a written submission during the period as well.
Great, thank you, Michael. Lauren, did I see your hand?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I heard two things that I would have questions about, or perhaps you could expand on them a little bit. I wasn't aware, but you had touched on the point that in November there was a commitment to come up with a plan, but it sounds like there was no commitment to funding the plan. And I guess my question would be, do you have a suggestion as to how much funding it may require to go ahead?
Yeah, so with respect to your first question, so the commitment I'm referring to was in the mandate letters of 5 ministers or 5 members of cabinet, including I believe 3 ministers after the election we had in October. So it found its way into the mandate letter of 5 ministers. You are correct that the commitment itself didn't include a specific funding allocation with it. And we were slightly concerned to not see it allocated in the 2021 budget. And for that reason, we really are emphasizing the need for it to be in next year's budget because developing an effective coastal strategy is going to take a bit of time, and it's really important that it be done this mandate if possible. With respect to your second question about how much money exactly is needed, I haven't come today with a specific number, but I just want to emphasize that I think a few things on that question and why we certainly shouldn't lowball a commitment to a coastal strategy is, first of all, as I said, the ocean is a large part and can be a large part of the BC economy if we manage it and support it in a sustainable way. Not having a ministry dedicated to ocean activities right now, like we might have for forestry, we need a substantial commitment to make this successful. And the other thing is when you look at plans that involve different orders of government, and in particular in our case, when you're working with Indigenous nations, it's really going to be important that everyone feel included and supportive of that strategy. And if we don't fund Indigenous nations to be part of that and to be proud of those plans and stand behind them, and other orders of government, then we might not have, this transformational coastal strategy that I think a lot of people are hoping for. So I would say, I could give you numbers from previous consultations on other legal, campaigns to change legal amendments, but I think one thing to keep in mind in this case is that the government wants to create it with Indigenous nations, and that we need to account that that's going to require some extra funding as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Michael, for your findings. It's every once in a while, some things happen good when you're behind the curve, and you've identified that this may be a positive effect that's there for not having it ready. My question isn't necessarily about money, but more about, because you've identified that there's been cross ministries, and I make the assumption that the federal government is part of this decision-making model as well to a certain extent. So rather than how much, but what would your expectation as to how long?
Okay. So interesting question. What I'll say about that is, just because you brought up, you're absolutely right that the federal government could have a very important role to play in this, because obviously the federal government has important ocean responsibilities, in particular for fishing and for shipping. And to have the federal government right now, who has also committed to developing a blue economy strategy right now, so a strategy for the economy of an ocean-based economy, is really kind of a good time to engage with the federal government. With respect to funding, I think we should make a distinction between the development of the coastal strategy and the implementation of the strategy. So we're certainly, at this point, we need to develop the strategy, but it's really going to be important if you put all that work into a strategy that it also does get funding long-term, so that the implementation of the strategy can continue. We've unfortunately had examples in the past, I'll just give you one example, but we've had smaller marine plans in scope. For example, we had the Fraser River Estuary Management Plan, which was a plan on where developments could occur in the Fraser River Estuary, and it did involve the federal government, provincial government, and local governments. And it worked for a while in the 1990s, but one of the problems was it didn't have a promise of long-term funding, and at one point the federal government cut off funding for that initiative. And so if you don't have long-term funding for the implementation afterwards, there's a risk that all that money you've put into developing a strategy will be all for naught.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We are now out of time. I want to thank you and the West Coast Environmental Law for your presentation and for your leadership in this area. As you say, our coast is a big part of British Columbia's identity. It's one of our defining features, and if we need to take transformational action in order to maintain that identity, it is really important that we have people at the table in the beginning who don't feel that something that big is imposed on them. We need to be doing this in partnership. So thank you for that perspective. And I look forward to reading your brief later.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So our next presenter is Jill Tipping with BC Tech Association. So Jill, you have 5 minutes to make your presentation. We'll signal you when you have 30 seconds left so that you have an opportunity to wrap up, and then it'll be open to the committee to ask questions. Now, I should mention to you the fact that there are so many empty seats here is not that we're not interested in the presentations. We've had a bit of a medical emergency, and that's being attended to.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to see you all. This is my first 3D interaction with government since the 4th of March, 2020. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to share the BC Tech Association's recommendations for Budget 2022. BC Tech is a member-based nonprofit that supports tech companies to grow and scale and supports non-tech audiences to understand and adopt technology. I'd like to start today by drawing the committee's attention to our recent publication. I'll make sure that you all have a copy. It's called A New Economic Narrative for BC. And it reviews the current state of the BC economy, how global trends are reshaping economies around the world, and what BC needs to do to position our economy to stay competitive for the future. Over the past 3 decades, a massive shift has occurred in BC as we rapidly became a knowledge and services-driven economy. So here are some statistics. Today, 80% of the jobs, 75% of the GDP, and 50% of our exports are from the services sector, not the goods sector. That surprises most people I share, and I assure you it's based on government data. But we've continued to allow our out-of-date 20th century thinking to drive decisions in the 21st century, and that's a mistake. So our report recommends that we must, as an urgent priority, start capturing better data on BC's economy to identify the real economic drivers of long-term prosperity and competitiveness in the knowledge economy. Number 2, to really embrace technology and innovation as the critical driver of economic growth and resilience, with increased investment in tech talent and support for entrepreneurs to scale up. And 3rd, to increase access to education and skills training and invest in the infrastructure of the services economy so that we're taking people with us and sharing prosperity. Specifically for the tech sector, we really want to make BC the best place to build a tech company by helping firms grow into scale-ups and anchor companies, the larger companies that really anchor our economy. We have long had a thriving tech sector with startups in abundance, and I think you know that. But our startups have struggled to scale up. In our 2020 tech report card, we found that of 11,000 tech companies in BC, only 220 of them employed 100 people or more. That's just 2% of our tech companies reaching that kind of measure of success, and it's not enough. Why? Well, startups are a vital and absolutely essential part of the ecosystem. That's why we recently launched a BC Tech for Startups program to support them and help them grow. But startups are, as the name implies, just the start of the story. We also need a thriving and growing spool of scale and anchor companies with 100+ employees. It's resilient scale-ups and anchor companies that deliver long-term economic strength and stability. Now, there's a myth that is often repeated to me as a fact, so I'd like to share it with you and bust it. It is that in BC, our tech companies just get acquired and leave BC. It's one of those things that might have been true 30 years ago and hasn't been true for a long time. Today, capital is in far greater supply than it was 30 years ago. So there's plenty of capital available to companies who want to grow and scale and put down roots rather than grow and sell and realize a quick gain. Today, it is tech talent that is the constrained resource. So even when a company is sold today, the new investor has just bought a team of talented people who can work together to create value as much as they've bought a business. The research shows that once a company reaches 100 or 200 employees, it's much more likely to stay in its local community, even if acquired. And that means the jobs stay. And the tax revenues that comes from those jobs stay. So here's the mission we must embrace. How can we ensure that more than the 2% make it? How can we embrace the challenge to enable 10% of our tech companies to reach that 100-person or more stage? That would mean another 1,000 scale and anchor companies for BC, not 220, 1,220. And that sounds like a mission worth getting our heads around. Now, mission-oriented innovation policy is not a new idea, and the government of British Columbia has, of course, partnered with Mariana Mazzucato to look at mission-driven oriented strategies for the new economic plan. I would propose that BC Tech's Scale Up BC proposal is an ideal mission-oriented innovation strategy. Scale Up BC is 11 organizations representing the tech ecosystems of Vancouver Island, the interior, the north, and the lower mainland, and we've come together to build a scale-up platform for BC. It's targeted accelerator programming that will grow the next generation of BC scale and anchor companies. And I just want to assure you that the return on investment associated with high-quality multi-year accelerator funding is very well established and documented. An independent third-party audit of BC Tech ourselves found that with every dollar government invested, we delivered $14 in GDP and $9 in tax revenues. And those are exceptional rates of return, whichever way you look at it. We're proposing a 10...
You're way over time, so if you
I
could just
apologize.
Finish up. Thank you.
A $10 million budget 22 investment from the provincial government will enable us to unlock $31 million in federal funding and launch the Scale Up BC platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Will you be following up with a written submission?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So I'll now open it up to questions from the committee. Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Elaine, for your level of enthusiasm. We see it from time to time here. Can you just explain the $12 million opening up federal money and how that works?
Yeah. So in April of 2019, the federal government invested $52 million in Ontario to leverage a provincial investment there of $24 million and launched a scale-up platform for Ontario. This fall, we will be invited to apply for federal funding for our Scale Up BC proposal, and we know that one of the critical success factors is the provincial government co-investing alongside. So $31 million will be our federal ask. $10 million is what we think we need to secure from the provincial government to access that $31 million, and we've been talking about this proposal for a while now, so we're fairly confident in those numbers and what would flow from that kind of investment.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much, Jill. I just would like to know more about, you mentioned about the tech talent shortage. And I guess what I'm thinking is, you know, a few years ago when we were talking about tech and growth and all these companies, is it because of our success or is it because of the shortage of people being trained at, you know, institutions that are, you know, putting out qualified tech staff? Where's the gap?
Well, we're in the lucky position that the demand for tech talent has never been higher, whether it's homegrown tech companies, inbound foreign investment tech companies, or non-tech companies that are discovering they must have tech talent internally to make a success of every industry. So it's a demand-driven issue, which is great for economic growth, to which we must respond with increased supply. So we need both more talent at the entry levels and also more senior experienced talent. Some of the immigration streams are extremely important to us. The PMP program is excellent, and the making permanent the tech stream has been a really good thing for the industry. But what we also want to see is funding for these kinds of ecosystem programs, because I like to say that we provide talent as a service. So if you can't access senior experienced talent to fill all 10 of your C-suite roles, you can access services from me that will somehow compensate for the lack of senior experienced talent in the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you.
Greg.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm hearing a lot about competitiveness and how BC stacks up with respect to other jurisdictions from a tax competitiveness position. Do you have any comments? Is that a concern for the industry sector as far as, you know, we certainly hear about some of the increasing cost barriers like cost of housing in the Lower Mainland, for example, but the other piece that I certainly hear a lot about from business owners is that we are continually to, I guess our tax competitiveness is starting to erode compared to other jurisdictions. Might you be able to comment a little bit on your perspective on that?
Sure. Well, it's definitely the case that we would like to have a very clear and coherent tax structure so that companies are very confident in what the cost of doing business will be in British Columbia. We tend to be an industry that is slightly less tax sensitive than others. We love to see a great environment because it definitely encourages more investment locally. But one of the benefits of the tech sector is that we do create well-paying jobs with, I like to talk about job years. When we create a tech job, we create a tech job for 30 years, not for 3 months or 3 years. And we future-proof the people of British Columbia, whichever direction the economy happens to grow, because we're investing in flexible skills. So the tech business is actually a people-based business more than it is a corporate-based business, I might call it that. And we're really invested in making sure that BC is a great place to live and grow and do great work and raise a family. And I will be honest, housing affordability is something that shows up with increasing regularity. Not just the price of single-family dwellings, but the price of rental apartments for young talent getting started. So housing more than tax, funnily enough, is actually where we start when we're thinking about what do we need to do to make this tech sector grow and grow sustainably in a way that works for everyone.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, with that, Jill, I will thank you so much for coming and making a presentation. Your numbers are very impressive, and it's a lot of food for thought. I think that we have been told for a long time that tech is our future and that we need to get ready for it, and you've certainly reinforced that. And I can say from my experience in my own community, we have some impressive tech companies. And yes, housing and childcare is what they say they want to keep the talent. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Our next presenter is Juan Solorzano, representing the Public Health Association of BC. So welcome, Juan. You have 5 minutes. We'll give you a signal when you have 30 seconds left so that you can wrap up your comments, and then we'll ask you questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here today. It's really a true honor to speak to elected officials in government. The role that you play in improving the health of residents in our province through your daily decisions is unparalleled, and we appreciate the difficult balance that you have to strike here, given the competing and diverse interests. As I mentioned, my name is Juan Solorzano. I'm here on behalf of PHABC, a non-for-profit, member-driven organization that represents public health professionals across the province. The current investments in public health represent approximately 3% of healthcare spending in BC, and this has been eroded over the years. This workforce hasn't increased despite increasing demands, and in the face of tightening budgets, it's often common to see some of the funding for public health to go to other healthcare areas. This is clearly a short-term gain for long-term loss, as investments in public health result in the reduced demand for hospital care. We have calculated that for every dollar spent in public health, the province stands to save approximately $7 in mental health and addiction treatment, for example, and an additional $30 in social cost and loss of productivity. And then over the course of the pandemic, this has really highlighted the importance of having a robust public health system, not just in terms of services, but also on disease surveillance and evidence-informed policies. Unfortunately, at this time of crisis, when we need our public health professionals the most, we're also facing a crisis within the system. Public health has been in the receiving end of unprecedented levels of antagonism. The expertise of local public health leaders has not been adequately appreciated and leveraged, and that has affected morale and performance of the professionals who have been making enormous sacrifices over the past year and a half. From public health units across the province, we hear concerning levels of staff burnout, the inability to recruit and retain professionals in the field, and prospective staff choosing other career paths. On behalf of PHABC, our members would like to recommend government to consider an increase in the investment of public health to 6% of the healthcare expenditure, and that this funding is ring-fenced, so it's directed to public health initiatives and with clearly articulated outcomes for health authorities. We also recommend that some of those funds go to the development of the public health workforce, and that we protect the scientists and public health leaders that can ensure the system readiness and surge capacity that we need. We also need to work with post-secondary educational institutions to prepare those public health professionals for facing the issues of the 21st century. The burden of the economic impacts from the pandemic, as well as the unintended consequences of the public health orders, have disproportionately affected the most disadvantaged members of our society. And while there has been a laser focus on the COVID cases, we have seen lesser attention on some of those serious impacts outside the cases. And recent surveys, for example, of our population have seen concerning deterioration of mental health in residents, particularly youth and children. We have seen increases in binge drinking and the use of cannabis use, as well as record increases in the deaths by overdose. Service disruptions have affected the deterioration of chronic conditions. And in the summer, we got to see the immediate impact that extreme weather events bring to the residents of our province. Many of these consequences will stay with us for years to come, and public health professionals will be called again to lead responses to these complex problems. In the face of this, the BC Public Health Association recommends that government leverages Budget 2022 to ensure that our province is ready to face these challenges. We recommend resourcing the implementation of a health in all policies approach across all government departments. This is because these complex problems require whole of government action, and it is critical that we strengthen our response capacity. To do this, we need to strengthen our public health surveillance, the population health data collection, and then to resource public health units in local areas to be able to work with partners and develop cross-sectoral interventions aimed at the root of the problems. We recognize that whenever we come here and request for additional funds, it's important that we also put forward some opportunities for generating revenue. And we echo our partners with the Alliance for Healthy Living in putting forward 3 revenue-generating proposals that include a cost recovery fee for tobacco and vapor products, setting minimum price for alcohol and taxing drinks based on alcohol content, and extending the provincial sales tax to non-carbonated sugary drinks, as well as working with the federal government on an excise tax on sugary drinks. These revenue sources have the dual benefit of also nudging behaviors towards healthier lifestyles. So with this, I conclude, and I just want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Juan. Now I'll open it up to questions from the committee. Greg.
Thank you very much. We received a number of presentations yesterday from BC Sport and different sports organizations in the province. They talked about some of the challenges we have with, I guess, the current pandemic, the impact it's had on reducing children's involvement in sports, which obviously will have potentially negative health outcomes in years ahead. You referenced, obviously, some of the challenges with new products like vaping, for example, and then you also referenced cannabis. And I'm not sure if there's been any stats really determined what the cannabis usage in British Columbia is now compared to 5 or 10 years ago. But when you reference taxation as one means of providing some additional dollars back into the system, I'm from the riding of Shuswap, and there's about 23 different cannabis shops that have appeared there in the last 3 years, all set up on First Nations reserve land. Not licensed, not complying with any particular regulation or policy, and no taxation whatsoever. So I'm certainly in my constituency often I'm hearing a lot of concerns from the legalized shops that have had to fall through and meet all of the different criteria, feeling that they can't compete on a level playing field with these cannabis retail shops that are set up, and they seem to be proliferating throughout the entire province. And yet there's no taxation whatsoever. And I appreciate it's a bit of a tricky situation where a lot of them are operating on Federal Reserve land, but do you see any opportunities for governments to provide some form of taxation? Because obviously there's, although the sale is being conducted on First Nations reserve lands, it's lots of folks that are living off reserve that are taking advantage of the uncompetitive nature of the taxation, and yet they're still having an impact, obviously, on our health system. So do you have any thoughts on that unlevel playing field that seems to be appearing in the province?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Thank you very much for it. And I'm recognizing the sovereign jurisdiction of First Nations governments on reserved land, and we can only point to the need to work in partnership for a regulatory framework that covers those instances, because it is important that we have, not just for the benefit of the cannabis industry, but just we have seen direct correlation in terms of price and access to consumption of substances like alcohol and cannabis. And the need to have a regulatory framework that covers the whole of British Columbia is very critical. I do recognize that it's a complex environment in terms of jurisdiction, and I will just recommend the partnership with First Nations communities for doing so. And perhaps if those dollars get directed to the First Nations communities themselves, might be able to level the playing field while still investing in their own health units.
Thank you.
Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Juan, for your presentation. Earlier on today, we heard from some organizations, and there was a lot of leapfrogging. They were supporting similar programs that were there, and it wasn't until the end of your presentation that you made mention of the Alliance for Healthy Living and those points that are there. My question to you is there correlation or partnerships formed with other organizations that are similar to what you're after, where that ask has already taken place and you're part of that partnership?
Yeah, the Alliance, thank you for the question. The BC Healthy Living Alliance brings together non-for-profit associations from across the province. The PHABC is a member of them, so the submission will be covering many of those aspects. Their submission has specifically focused on investments at the non-for-profit level. We are focusing more on the public health units that are part of the health authorities. That's the particular focus of our submission. But I think there's an opportunity of working in a proposal that integrates that better. So I think that's a good challenge for us to take it back and see how perhaps as a follow-up in our written submission brings the connection between the different proposals. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Juan. Just the number you touched on, 6% increase in public health funding, and I kind of heard a broad spectrum of what you think that money should go to. So the 6% is based on like 6% of what? And what are the specific things?
So thank you. The recommended increase is going from the current 3% of healthcare expenditure to 6%. So I guess it's a 3%, it's a 100% increase to public health funding, representing 6% of the health expenditure. BC spent last year about $21 billion in healthcare, and revenue across provinces is becoming more and more directed to healthcare. So it's a real concern that we don't invest upstream. So our proposal is to go to about $1 billion of investment. That's what 6% represents, $1 billion into public health units. So it's about a 100% increase. What we see is that there will be cost avoidance as a result of those investments upstreams. And then, as I mentioned, the three revenue sources that are very targeted taxation strategies. I think we're very concerned about regressive taxation that punishes those who have less means, and rather focus on those that nudge the behavior in the right direction.
And your solution for some of the taxation to get that back, you mentioned sugary drinks, I think, at the end, right?
That's right.
I think the government's already taken steps to implement a tax on sugary drinks. A little bit, okay, all right. Increase, I'm just wondering, will your submission, you don't have to answer this now, but your submission will explain your recommendation for increased taxation on tobacco products and the one you mentioned, alcohol by volume, and how that would be, just so we can understand.
Absolutely, yeah. And both those three submissions or recommendations are also included in the BC Alliance for Healthy Living. So our written submission, and that will be referencing both.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thanks very much.
Thank you.
We're out of time, Juan, so we'll have to wrap it up. But I do, on behalf of the committee, want to thank you for making a presentation, and I also want to thank the members that you represent. You have reminded us that they're on the front line when it comes to the health emergency that we've had in the last 18 months. I guess it's more than that now, but also reminding us that they're more than just jobs and services, that there are our neighbors, family members who haven't just protected us, it's had an impact on them as well. And we note that.
Thank you for the acknowledgement.
So, thank you very much
for the opportunity.
And just, I mean, as you're packing up, so sorry if it seemed like we were distracted. We have had a medical emergency right here in this room that we've been coping with. So, our next presenter is Tessa Seeger, Council of Canadian Innovators. So come to the table, Tessa. You have 5 minutes. We will give you a signal when you have 30 seconds to go so you can wrap up, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, great. Ready to start?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members of the Standing Committee for meeting with us today here on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, where we are grateful to live, work, and play. As the Chair said, I'm Tessa Seeger. I'm the BC lead for the Council of Canadian Innovators, which is a business council that represents over 140 of Canada's scaling technology companies, including 15 based here in BC. Led by our chairs, Jim Balsillie and John Ruffalo, we advocate for policy that spurs innovation and helps domestic tech companies successfully scale up globally. Today, I want to do 3 things. I want to tell you what scale-ups are, I want to tell you why scale-ups matter, and I want to tell you what scale-ups need from you. Put simply, scale-ups are technology companies that are well beyond the startup stage. They are selling products or services, they are making millions in annual recurrent revenue, they have positive cash flow, they pay taxes, they employ dozens, if not hundreds of people, and they are all hiring rapidly. They are attracting an array of positive spillover effects, from investment attraction to philanthropy. Most importantly, they are growing, meaning with the right supports, they can scale in revenue from millions to billions, providing valuable returns to national economies. And that is precisely why these companies, these scale-ups, matter. Scale-ups are a local community's best economic resource. Innovation experts have consistently said that one essential element for sustained regional growth is the significant concentration of scale-up companies. It is only with the continued success of our scale-ups will our economy have the wealth-generating capacity needed to pave the way forward for a post-pandemic recovery. That brings us to the question of what our scale-ups need from you, our provincial government. While a full written submission will supplement my remarks, today I want to focus on 2 concerning trends our members are experiencing firsthand. The first trend is an inability to access talent. The second trend is our inability to adapt to the 21st century digital economy. First, on talent. For years, the biggest issue hindering BC tech companies' ability to scale has been access to highly skilled workers. The shift to the remote work during the pandemic has only exacerbated the problem. Over the past 12 months, we've been hearing from our members that it's harder than ever to find and retain highly skilled talent. With the pervasiveness of remote work, physical geography and national borders no longer matter. Highly skilled Canadians are now the target for Silicon Valley tech companies without ever having to leave their home offices or their kitchen islands. This geographical freedom, together with foreign multinationals' ability to pay significantly higher salaries, is distorting the talent pool and having a direct impact on the ability of Canadian firms to compete and attract the highly skilled talent they need to grow and scale. To help BC tech companies gain access to talent in this new post-pandemic economy, Budget 2022 must do 3 things. It must commit to work with the federal government to pursue innovative immigration policies, like the United Kingdom's new high-potential individual route and its new scale-up route, so companies can access more imported talent. It must further invest in upskilling, reskilling, and micro-credential programs to create a new source of domestic talent. And it must incentivize repatriation to bring back the Canadian-bred talent that so often leaves our borders. With these measures, BC can start to create, attract, and retain the talent that our scale-ups need. The second trend I want to identify is more structural and pervasive. And I think you heard it from my friend Jill 2 sessions earlier. Over the last 40 years, there has been a remarkable shift from the tangible economy to the intangible one. This new economy is no longer mainly fueled by capital assets like equipment and machinery, but instead is increasingly driven by intangible assets such as domain names, software, and patented technologies. Data and intellectual property have become the 2 most valuable assets in the world and are now the primary source of wealth creation. Despite this, governments across the country have maintained a stubborn reliance on 19th and 20th century policy strategies, ones that have nothing to do with how wealth is generated in the 21st century global economy. This has resulted in us lagging significantly in the global IP and data race. To right the ship and capture this wealth, BC needs to update its policy infrastructure by following through on its commitment to develop a provincial intellectual property strategy, including the implementation of a patent box for biotech and other key industry sectors, by modernizing its privacy regulations, and by building a provincial data strategy. Only by embracing this 21st century policy infrastructure will BC be positioned for success in a post-pandemic, data-driven economy. On behalf of CCI's members, we look forward to working together to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. Now I'll invite members of the committee to ask you some questions. Lauren.
I think mine's a simple one on a very complex presentation. You mentioned committing to work with Canadian immigration to help get people here. I understand that that is an issue. And the third thing you mentioned was bring back Canadian talent. What was the one between there?
That one is investing in upskilling, reskilling, and micro-credential programs. So creating a new source of domestic talent from people that might be looking to retrain through some labor shortages created by the pandemic.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Ben and then Mike.
Thanks very much. Tessa, that was great. It was really good to hear your presentation, and I look forward to more details in amongst the written submission. The last thing you touched on, though, was the intangible economy, and you mentioned BC provincial protection of IP, or was it IP? I guess I'm just wondering, is that a provincial jurisdiction that we actually have the authority over? Is that federal? And secondly, I want to know more about the privacy regulations you said that need updating.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of those things where the federal government has a role to play in protecting IP, and the provincial government does as well. So actually, the BC government has committed to implementing a provincial intellectual property strategy, and that will be BC focused. And then you can see there's action being taken on the federal side as well.
Okay.
Did you want some detail about what intellectual property, a provincial intellectual property strategy could look like, or would you like to just look at it in our submission?
No, in your submission's fine. I want to know about the privacy.
Yeah, okay.
The only reason being is I think it's being reviewed right now, and I know the file reasonably well. I'd just like to know what's lagging in it or what's not there.
Yeah, that's great. And as you say, the special committee has been constituted to review the Personal Information Protection Act, which is the private sector privacy legislation. CCI made a submission, so it's available online, but I can also send it to you individually if you want. I think the important thing to note on that is that the legislation hasn't been substantively updated since 2004, but our digital world in 2021 looks significantly different than it did then. So from our position, it's time to modernize the legislation in a way that protects consumers' privacy, but also encourages and promotes digital innovation. So what we're looking for, first and foremost, is this concept of interoperability. What we really don't want to see is provinces implementing a patchwork of frameworks that companies who operate in multiple jurisdictions have to comply with each individual regime. So we're looking for provinces to work with each other as they go about modernizing their privacy legislation.
I think Michael McVoy, who's the privacy commissioner, I believe he is working with other jurisdictions, but not all jurisdictions. And I think that that is an important point in this day and age. So I appreciate your comments, and maybe we can make some, or try and help in that regard.
Great.
Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tessa, for your presentation. And I like the fact that there's some overlap between the BC Tech Association as well, because the same issues seem to be there with retaining and maintaining staff and finding people to enter into it. And I just, from what you've said, it seems counterproductive to be going down the route of immigration. So inside of it, it talks about United Kingdom's new high potential individual route. So does that not become counterproductive to finding, locating, and retaining local talent?
Our members need talent. They're trying to grow so rapidly. We have some members, they have a current workforce of 1,100. They're looking to increase it to 1,800. They just need talent here, and there's not enough domestic talent to fill it. So they look to access domestic talent, and then they look to access external talent and bring in talent from abroad.
Okay. So if I may, so when you're talking about bringing in the extra talent from abroad, it's not excluding any local talent then from entering into that?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we're out of time, Tessa. But thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for fielding our questions. I just, in wrapping up, I'm struck by the term intangible economy and all that implies in terms of going forward. It's like we're in a new industrial revolution.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. So before we recess for a bit of a break, we'll now hear from Locke Dow with DigiBC. So Locke, you have 5 minutes, and when you have 30 seconds to go, we'll signal so that you know that you can wrap up. And I don't know if you were here in the room previously when I apologized for what looked like a lot of distractions and empty chairs. We've had a medical emergency. So it's not that people aren't interested in what you're saying.
Thank you. I walked in as the stretcher was coming out, so I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry to hear that happened. So thank you for having me. I'm Locke Dow, the Executive Director of DigiBC. DigiBC is the Creative Technology Association of BC. We represent over 250 companies in the video games, animation, visual effects, virtual reality, and augmented reality and mixed reality subsectors, employing over 14,000 people and bringing in over $2.3 billion a year. BC has long been a leader in the creative tech sector and started as far back as the 80s, where we developed a global reputation as a leading creative tech hub. Our member companies are delivering products that are internationally recognized, and many of you or your children or grandchildren may have enjoyed, from EA's FIFA soccer game to NHL to Apex Legends to Atomic Cartoons, Indigenous Kids animated series, Molly of Denali, that's on CBC Gem and PBS, to Animal Logic's Lego movies and Peter Rabbit, the Coalition, which is part of Microsoft, Gears of War, Hyper Hippo in Kelowna, who makes Adventure Capitalist and whose co-founder is responsible for the existence of many tech companies in Kelowna after his previous company, Club Penguin, was purchased by Disney in the 2000s. ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, that makes visual effects for the Star Wars films and The Mandalorian, and they're innovating in virtual production, which brings together real-time computer graphics, filmmaking, and virtual reality technologies. As the sector continues to evolve, creative tech will continue to push the boundaries, but our tech can also improve operations and gain efficiencies in more traditional industries. Using artificial and virtual reality, our members are already helping drive digital transformation in natural resource industries. Unity Technologies in Port Coquitlam and Lamazoo out of Victoria develops digital twins of natural resource projects, which allow traditional industries to visualize data, streamline procedures, and enhance collaborations. Coming out of the pandemic, BC's creative tech sector weathered the storm better than most. Video games, animation, and visual effects were resilient. Lots of animation being watched and lots of video games being played. To cope with the pandemic, our member companies were able to pivot relatively seamlessly to remote work. In fact, employment in the animation and video game subsectors increased in BC by 20% over that time, with most new employees yet to step foot into the office. DigiBC and the provincial government share common priorities, including equity, in equality, meaningful reconciliation, and inclusive economic recovery. In the midst of the pandemic and in the wake of this summer's devastating wildfires, many British Columbians already experiencing job losses in natural resource industries face additional economic dislocation due to declining tourism. The creative tech sector and DigiBC's member companies is well poised to help. Our member companies can help rural communities get back on their feet. Creative tech firms and employees aren't limited to being located in the Lower Mainland and Greater Victoria. They can work anywhere where there's broadband and power. With so much global demand, we have the capacity to hire people who have lost their jobs, diversify the tech sector, and tackle the province's skill shortage. Addressing these priorities now will ready us for the new economy, building a pipeline of diverse talent that is critical to the success of our sector, and investing in the next generation of BC's tech workers. To ensure that British Columbians can acquire the skills needed to work in our sector, we're already working with post-secondary institutions, from micro-credentialing programs to make education more accessible, to creating equity, diversity, and inclusion co-op and internship opportunities. This investment in education isn't new for DigiBC. For years, we've been investing in skills training for the next generation with programs like DigiCamp for underrepresented youth, teaching video game development for kids 9 to 13, and Play to Learn, a high school programming taught from a race and gender lens to invite all students to consider a career in our industry. Our strength is BC's strength, and we can help contribute to the recovery, but we require provincial government support to succeed. Implementation of Alan Winter's 2020 report, Putting Innovation to Work for British Columbia, growing BC's companies would help our efforts. Keeping competitive is also key to our sector's continued development and our ability to connect British Columbians with the skills they need to succeed in this rapidly evolving digital industry. The interactive digital media tax credit has been critical to the stability and growth of the sector. We believe that targeted tax credits of 10% for firms locating beyond the Lower Mainland and Greater Victoria and 10% for businesses employing underrepresented groups would help spur rural economic development and foster diversity. To level the playing field with other jurisdictions, we'd like to see it increase to 25% of eligible wages and salaries and extended beyond 2023. Thank you for all you and your colleagues have done to protect British Columbians during the pandemic and to make sure people remain safe. These efforts will again be critical for people in every part of the province and for every sector of the economy as we move forward into recovery.
Thank you, Locke. Now, before I open it up for questions, did you say that the creative technology for The Mandalorian was done in BC?
Some of the visual effects scenes are done here, and the underlying technology for virtual production is starting to be developed here. Yeah.
So Baby Yoda is a British Columbian?
Baby Yoda's outer layer of lighting and skin, I think.
Okay, questions?
Thanks very much, Locke. I want to go back to that last part about the interactive digital tax credit you talk about. Is it currently 10% that you're eligible for, and you'd like to see it moved up to 25?
It's currently 17.5%, and we'd like to see it move to 25, yeah. Okay. And then we have the 2 targeted top-ups that we're proposing for rural economic investment, right, for companies located outside of the Lower Mainland of Victoria, and then an EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, 10% top-up as well. So.
Okay. This presentation, I just would like it to be completely clear so that we understand it, that's all.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a little bit, well, it's vague to me. Maybe the others understand it better, but anyways.
Okay.
Thanks.
No, thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Luke, for your presentation. And I agree with MLA Stewart. There's a little bit of here that it's a little bit fuzzy, but okay. I was just happy to see names in a video game that I recognize with Mario and Luigi for a change. But when I look at this, I want to ask the question because I see that you want to see a bigger tax credit to spur rural economic development and foster diversity. And if it was really clear, like this is the bump that we're looking for, I think it kind of solves some of the other problems that we hear throughout this session about how hard is it to get rural BC involved in some of this stuff that's there, and where does our intellect go once you get trained to what's there. So was that the intent? Is the bump, and what would that bump be?
Yeah, the bump would be 10% for companies that have employees or offices outside of Metro Vancouver and Greater Victoria, and an additional separate 10% for companies that hire from underrepresented groups, so they could apply for both depending on if they qualified or not, in addition to the current 17.5 base tax credit. So it'd be a way to target the tax credit towards some of our goals and some of the province's goals.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Lauren, did I see your hand?
Yeah, my question was around that same topic. I can appreciate, trust me, I welcome the idea that you would want to incentivize a company to move some of their operations to rural BC. My question is, what is the appetite from these companies that I can imagine there would be some benefits, obviously, to being in Metro Vancouver and surrounded by colleagues and peers, etc. What is the appetite for that?
For video games, it's very much happening right now. We have VR companies in Nanaimo. We have companies in Victoria. As I mentioned, Kelowna has a good little cluster. But what's changed since the pandemic is the nature of work, and it's still being discussed right now, but remote work and people going back to the office is not going to be what was expected. So there's a lot of employees that have moved back to help their parents out during the pandemic, and they've stayed there in rural communities, and they're working remotely. So I think we're seeing that as an opportunity because we're able to work like that in our sector to embrace that. And so we could hire people in rural communities and they could stay there working for our companies. Very much like how the tech companies have been doing that for years, right, with teams that are distributed around the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you very much. So the additional 10% top-up, I certainly understand the justification or rationale for it, but when you have individuals that have already, say, moved out of Metro Vancouver or out of the Victoria area and are living remotely with families or whatever it may be, they're already benefiting from, lower housing costs, lower costs of living. The extra 10% would ultimately, just for those individuals, just be an extra, I guess, incentive or discount for the company. How would that actually incent additional hires? So do you feel that the extra 10% top-up would somehow give the companies the incentive to actually have more focus on remote hiring, are there additional costs in setting up employees to work remotely than having them work at an office, for example?
Yeah, I think it would help the companies expand their infrastructure and their remote infrastructure. So for the ability to meet and to work remotely. I've heard from company owners that's how they use part of the current tax credit, right, to help expand their operations. So that extends from physical to online as well. And I think at a certain point, if certain companies have more than a certain number of employees in a new location, there would also be brick and mortar costs if they wanted to be in an office in that town. Right?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, okay, one more question.
Thank you, Chair. Just you touched on brick and mortar, and certainly that in itself could be a very good-sized incentive for these businesses, right? I mean, any kind of office space in the Caribou, for instance, is certainly a fraction of what it would be downtown Vancouver, although we do have housing problems throughout, or shortages rather, throughout the entire province. But definitely there is a massive incentive for commercial space, I would think.
One of the scenarios I've discussed with some of our CEOs is we're a global industry, but they're very pro-BC and pro-Canada, but some of them have opened branch offices in Ontario or Quebec to find additional talent, and because the tax credit is better in those provinces, they have told me that they would move those branch offices and have them they'd prefer to have them in rural BC if there was matching incentives. So.
Yeah.
And Greg has a final question.
Yeah, actually, thank you very much, Madam Chair. So further to MLA Dorkson's question, and I know this had come up previously with film and tax credits, is that do you feel that the additional 10% top-up that you're looking for, if it was targeted and if there's a requirement for companies to actually invest that in capital investments in the province, would you see that as a hindrance? I guess the challenge is that sometimes some of these additional credits, if they're deemed to be a subsidy and it just flows to the bottom line and these corporates are American held or held from other provinces or jurisdictions around the globe, the dollars aren't actually being invested back in our communities. And so, you know, the idea of a 10% top-up, would DigiBC be amenable to having that as some kind of requirement that there's actually an offsetting capital investment back in our province?
Yeah, many of our members have brought that up in our planning discussions and fully proposed that. Most of our members, even our global companies like EA, do invest back in real estate, you know, mainly here, but with their bigger offices, and then all the, you know, connected benefits, the connected GDP benefits off of that. So, I don't think I don't see any opposition to that. So.
Okay, one more.
I guess further to Emily Kylo's questions, you know, if there was an incentive to bring these companies back, what could that look like to BC? I mean, 14,000 employees in the province. Do you have any idea, or can you suggest what it might mean for more jobs, more investment, what that might look like?
We're projecting 20% within 2 years at the latest, but maybe in the next year. The growth is it's really high right now, and on top of it, we have, as you know, Disney is coming. As I'm sure my colleague from MPA mentioned. So Disney is coming, so that's 300 new jobs that we anticipate or more. And each of my members has been renegotiating office space to accommodate a substantial increase. So, yeah. So I think you know, if we could time that to have them target some of that growth outside of the Lower Mainland and bring back some of the subsidiaries, I think that would, you know, be very well received.
Thank you, and thank you for the patience of the chair.
Thanks to all of you. Yes, thank you for your presentation, Locke, and thank you for engaging the committee. This is, I got to say that after, you know, having heard a lot of presentations that quite rightfully paint a grim picture of the future and ask us to try to turn that around, your presentation is such a presentation of hope for the future, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So we'll take a break right now. How long do we have? I know our next speaker's here. So we'll take a 10-minute break now, and we'll probably be able to take another one a bit later. Yes. So we'll reconvene the committee. I'll invite Nigel Smith from Triumph to come to the table. And before we proceed, I do again want to apologize for what appears to be a bit of chaos. We had a medical emergency involving a committee member earlier, and hence some of the empty seats, and hence what appears to be a bit of a distraction. But we definitely welcome your presentation, and you have our entire attention. So you have 5 minutes. We will signal you when you have 30 seconds so that you can proceed to a wrap-up, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Nigel Smith. I'm Director and CEO of Triumph, which is Canada's Accelerator Centre. So I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm thankful to be presenting to you today from the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I also respectfully acknowledge that Triumph itself is located on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I'm actually relatively new to Triumph. I joined Triumph in May of this year, so this is my first interaction with this committee, and I'm very pleased to be here to introduce myself and share some of my perspectives. I come to Triumph after 12 years running a facility, an underground laboratory in Northern Ontario in a nickel mine in Sudbury. And in my short time here, I've certainly been struck by a number of things. Firstly, the scenery and the weather here is substantially different to Northern Ontario. And secondly, more importantly to this committee, the fact that British Columbia has a wealth of world-class talent and infrastructure at its disposal. So you will have already heard similar comments from my colleagues at many of BC's post-secondary institutions, but British Columbia's strength in these areas ideally positions us to chart a bold and prosperous path out of the current pandemic. Founded more than 53 years ago, Triumph plays a significant role in BC's science and innovation ecosystem. It's located in Vancouver, and it's Canada's Particle Accelerator Centre. It's home to about $1 billion worth of unique infrastructure and world-leading talent, most of which is trained right here in BC. And Triumph carries out both fundamental science and use-inspired research that's changing the world. And that's from advancing our understanding of the beginnings of the universe to advances in batteries and cures for cancer. And we stand at the forefront of research. So I'm here today to encourage investment in BC's research and innovation sectors, specifically in areas of strength where our province can have a competitive advantage both nationally and internationally. And one such area is indeed particle accelerators and radioisotope technologies, where Triumph has spent over 50 years fostering activity and expertise. And this is very evident in the development and production of medical isotopes for the diagnosis and treatment of critical illness, from neurological disorders to cancer. And leveraging this strength, in 2018, Triumph announced the construction of the Army facility, the Institute for Advanced Medical Isotopes. And this is designed to provide BC with isotope security, develop next-generation cancer therapies, and enable clinical trials to improve patient outcomes. It supports medical research and drives technological innovation and skills training. And it's supported by both federal and provincial governments, BC Cancer Foundation, and the University of British Columbia. And IARMI construction is well underway. Initial operations are set to begin in the second quarter of 2022. The pandemic demonstrated the need for investment in life sciences research and lab capacity in the province, and IARMI can help fill that requirement. And Triumph and BC Cancer are seeking parallel investments to build out space that enables the medical, scientific and technological innovations that will create a strong and resilient British Columbia. So Triumph is seeking $7 million to construct 3 additional laboratories with space for preclinical and clinical research, as well as facilities for the research and development of specialized pharmaceuticals, medical isotopes, and other life-saving agents. And it's well aligned with provincial priorities. It will provide and add key capacity to BC's health system by ensuring BC Cancer and other health providers have a secure local supply of critical medical isotopes to support a 10-year cancer action plan. It will increase health system resiliency by creating new lab spaces that can be used to unlock surge capacity for British Columbia in the case of future pandemics. It will enable innovation by providing researchers and early-stage companies access to these highly specialized infrastructures needed to scale up products and enter the market. And it creates new skills and education opportunities through collaboration with academic partners and early-stage companies. Expanding the lab capacity within IAMI offers significant cost and time saving compared to a new build, and the time to take advantage of this is now. If funding is secured soon, this additional capacity could be online within 2 years. So in closing, I hope I've made clear the value of targeted investments in BC's science and research infrastructure, and in particular, the benefits associated with additional investment in IAMI. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. We'll now invite the committee to ask any questions.
Thanks, Nigel. I think we're all, I actually remember the last crisis we had where there was a failure in the isotope production somewhere and Triumph came to the rescue. So it is a very important asset in Canada, let alone British Columbia. So the $7 million for the 3 labs is in addition to the expansion for the IAMI that's under construction?
That's right. So it fills out basically shell space. So BC's already invested just over $12 million in the initial development of IAMI, and this would fill out the additional space. It's in conjunction with an ask that BC Cancer itself is putting in, which is about $15 million. So between us, we would then complete the IAMI internal infrastructure and provide space for 2 cyclotrons and the required lab structures.
Okay. What more can we do? I only say that meaning we're coming through this pandemic and we're looking at all the things that we don't have in Canada, and we're thinking about the foresight in having something like this that's been here for over 50 years. I mean, reality is I think we'd like to have more independence if that's possible. So,
well, I think it's a great question because collaboration between the various agencies is really critical in coming out of the pandemic, and that's certainly true in things like the isotope production. So this IAM is a great example of that in terms of the collaboration that's occurring between Triumph, between BC Cancer, University, and it's a great example of how when we do pull together, we can pull these capabilities in.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're enjoying BC.
Mike.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for your presentation. It is always nicer to be up above ground than below ground, so we can see what's there. I just want to ask the question with regards to, I mean, everything that's on there, I think everybody in this room wants. I mean, I don't think that there's anybody that's in any disagreement with what you're able to achieve. But is it 18 to 24 months? Is that doable?
It is, because the IAMI construction is actually well advanced. If you come through Triumph, which would be great, then you can see the building is already very well advanced, and we anticipate taking beneficial occupancy next year in terms of the first phase of the development. And so the time to look at completing that, the rest of the labs, completing the shells, is now. And I think the opportunity affords itself right now because we do have the construction teams in place, and the project management and things like that are in place at the moment.
Just one follow-up. Where would that position British Columbia in relationship to other provinces?
Well, British Columbia is unique in terms of some of the infrastructure like Triumph. There is no other province that has the cyclotron, for instance, that we have, which is a major investment generally. And that gives us the capability, the skills to run these other cyclotrons that are used for the medical isotope production. So we have a lot of experience in generating medical radioisotopes. What's developing with the relationship with our medical partners, the ability to target those radioisotopes. So basically, that's the warhead, if you like, that is then targeted to the cancer. And so that's where the collaboration comes in, developing the capability to really target these isotopes into the cancerous cells. And British Columbia is uniquely positioned in terms of some of these capabilities.
Thank you.
Greg.
Thank you, Nigel, for your presentation. I had the opportunity to tour the facility back in 2015. I think it was with respect to BC's jobs plan, and that's when there was some of the initial discussion around the medical isotopes. What kind of international inspections are required for the facility, or is it all captured under Canada's jurisdiction, or is there an international organization that also has responsibility for inspecting your facility?
It's all captured nationally, basically. So there are protocols that you need to comply with in terms of if you do want to export or take the medical isotopes into other areas, but they're all very well understood. And that's actually part of the ask is one of the labs that we're looking to outfit is a quality control lab. So we're looking to develop what's called a GMP. I forgot what the GMP is, but yeah, it's a quality control system that would then allow you to basically export those medical isotopes. But it's all within the purview of the national regulatory bodies.
It's like as MLA Stewart mentioned, we had a bit of a shortage in Canada a number of years ago, and I think the initial focus was to try and provide, I guess, an opportunity to not be reliant on other jurisdictions. But export is part of the opportunity and kind of the expansion plan. And what do you see the potential growth is for medical isotopes, as far as international sales?
I think there's a lot of opportunity. It depends on the isotope, and it depends on the way that you create them. So the initial point that was being raised was in terms of something called technetium-99 that came from actually the nuclear reactor production of medical isotopes, and the way that we're doing it is different using cyclotrons. And so, depending on the isotope itself and the half-life of that isotope, there are opportunities, for instance, in terms of putting cyclotrons into hospitals rather than sending the drug itself. And so, that's where the technological developments come in. The focus at the moment is very much on ensuring that BC has the reliability of the medical isotope. So that's where our current focus is.
Fantastic, thank you.
Well, our time is up, Nigel, but thank you very much for your presentation and for responding to questions from the committee. I do confess that I don't really understand the science, but I understand that you save lives. And welcome to British Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
So our next presenter is Damien Strathonikis, Building Owners and Managers Association of BC. You have 5 minutes. We'll let you know when it's time to wrap up. She'll raise a sign that says 30 seconds to go, and then there'll be time for questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee, and staff. My name is Damien Strathonikis. I'm the president of the Building Owners and Managers Association of BC, commonly referred to as BOMA. I'd like to acknowledge we're on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Our over 300 members own or manage most of the commercial space in BC, as well as the businesses that support them. Our industry contributes over $4.5 billion annually to the provincial economy and employs over 40,000 British Columbians. BOMA supports your objectives to build a strong, sustainable, and innovative economy for all British Columbians. We'll be submitting detailed recommendations, but this afternoon I wanted to highlight 3 areas where provincial investments would bring more opportunities for British Columbians. First, in labor market development. As we transition out of the pandemic, we are focused on the future and diversity within our industry. We will need close to 5,000 facility operation and maintenance managers and nearly 4,000 property administrators in the next decade. With 50% of BC's Indigenous population under the age of 25, we plan to add this demographic group and other traditionally underrepresented communities to take part within our industry with stable, well-paying jobs. For the past 5 years, we've worked with the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Training to develop and execute a sector labor market strategy for the commercial property and facility management industry. This strategy includes developing paths for underrepresented communities and equity-seeking groups. We encourage the government to continue to support our ongoing efforts in this area. With an additional 3.4 million square foot of commercial real estate coming to downtown Vancouver alone by 2024, we believe there is a need for a focused commercial property management licensing program. Right now, residential and commercial property managers are licensed the same way, despite job requirements being quite different. We encourage the BC Financial Services Authority to work with our industry to invest in developing an appropriate and targeted training and licensing program specific for commercial property management. Second, climate change adaptation. BOMA has been a leader in transforming the commercial real estate industry in environmental efficiency, sustainability, and resiliency. Along with our BOMA Best Building Certification Program to improve building operations and efficiency, we launched the Greater Victoria 2030 District, the second one in Canada. It's an initiative to reduce waste and emissions by 50% by the year 2030 to 2007 levels. We now have over 3.4 million square feet of commercial, office, and retail space in Greater Victoria committed by leading commercial property managers, and we encourage the government to support the development of additional partnerships like the 2030 District in other parts of BC. To aid building owners in meeting the province's future emission reduction targets, we have worked closely with the Building Safety Standards Branch on the development of the future renovation code for existing buildings. We feel strongly that forcing major retrofit renovations at the time of application for a building permit is the wrong approach. Instead, we encourage the province to offer major incentive programs for mechanical equipment, roofing materials, building envelope, or insulation technologies at the natural end of their life cycle. We have partnered with the Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Low Carbon Innovation, as well as BC Hydro, on how best to structure a retrofit incentive program over the next 5 years. Third, tax policy. Due to a combination of elevated property taxes and an increase in upzoning, commercial building owners are paying up to 4.5 times the residential tax rate in municipalities such as Vancouver. To offset this imbalance, we support the request from the City of Vancouver and other municipalities to create a split assessment property tax category for commercial buildings. This allows the unused residential density above the property to be properly accounted for and billed, rather than treated as more expensive commercial development density. Our building owners feel challenged to invest in major greenhouse gas reduction retrofits, as tenants benefit from the energy savings rather than the owners. While we are encouraged by the announcement of programs like the Commercial PACE pilot project, we recommend full provincial legislation be tabled, which allows municipalities to adopt CPACE. We also believe that property tax credits for energy and resiliency upgrades to existing buildings should be encouraged by the province, with financial support to municipalities for the loss of potential municipal tax revenue. We ask the province to consider developing or expanding the revitalization tax credit program for municipalities who choose to encourage energy and resiliency retrofits through property tax credits. We believe these recommendations will make a positive impact to growing BC's economy, provide more jobs for British Columbians. Thank you again to all of you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Damien. I'll now turn to the committee to ask you some questions.
Thanks very much, Damien. And I just wanted to clarify the second axe was on climate change in terms of is this association or building owners being forced to implement changes on before end of life of equipment currently because of some law, or is it, I'm just, you said something about building permit.
Yes.
And I'm just kind of confused. When I hear building permit, I'm thinking new, but is it just a renovation or leasehold improvements?
Right.
And right now they're saying, okay, is that what's happening? And
Exactly. So what happens, for example, in municipalities like Vancouver is that if you are making, let's say, a change to the space, a new tenant has come in, they want more space, it can trigger energy efficiency upgrades that include things like getting rid of equipment before the end of its life in order to be able to meet those requirements. We're also seeing targets that are set by the province, Metro Vancouver, other municipalities to look at limiting GHG emissions, which also ends up forcing people to look at their buildings and say, well, if I need to meet this target, I have to make these investments. My boiler, for example, still has another 15 years left in its lifespan. Why should I invest a huge amount of money to either electrify that boiler or switch it out when I still have 15 years of good life left? So we think it makes more sense to align incentives, to align policy with the natural life cycle of building equipment. People will need to make those replacements anyways. Why not use the opportunity then to incentivize higher efficiency electrification projects as opposed to, getting rid of something that still has life in it?
okay, let me just ask a second question, if I may. As a landlord of commercial space, and I have that inefficient boiler that's still got 15 years, but as the tenant, I'm likely the one that's paying the emissions, like whatever the increased CO2 payment is on whatever the consumption is, right?
So what happens now is tenants pay what are often referred to as the common area maintenance charges. So that includes your energy costs.
Yeah.
And that's also a challenge for landlords because they want to make a building operate more efficiently, but ultimately they're not the ones who benefit from lower energy costs. It's the tenant who benefits from lower energy costs because their common area maintenance charges are lower. So it's often referred to as a split incentive because the building owner is caught in a bind. They want to make these investments, and in some cases they go ahead anyways. They see there's value. They have a corporate mandate for sustainability, for example. Often people look at improving the valuation of the building, but as we can see from our neighbors across the Rockies and Calgary, commercial real estate prices don't always go up. We're very fortunate in the Lower Mainland, but not so in other parts of the province. So our goal, and that's my comment around property taxes, is that one way of incentivizing these investments in energy efficiency is by allowing things like tax credits. So a building owner invests in a new boiler, and they're able to then use the property tax credit to recoup some of that investment while passing on both the energy savings to the tenant.
So if the government wants to pursue, or it does want to pursue its climate change goals, what would make building owners and the tenants come together and what would be the incentive?
Yeah, I think it's timing the incentives at the right moment to make sure that we end up in a scenario where people are switching out equipment at the right time as opposed to being forced to do it. It's also looking at educating tenants. I think there's a lot that we can do as an industry, but also a lot the province can do to educate people that there is value in renting space in an energy efficient building, that it's desirable to be in a building that emits less carbon than in another building that doesn't.
Okay, thanks very much.
Do we have any other questions? Lauren.
Quick one. Thanks for the presentation. Can you clarify for me what you were talking about, the tax incentive for upper floors? I think you...
Yeah, so right now when you have let's say a small strip mall and it's zoned for multifamily residential, it is currently taxed, the space above the air that is above this development. Let's say it could be a 30-story condominium building. That actual density is currently charged at a commercial property rate because the underlying property itself is a commercial building. What we're saying is it doesn't make sense for that to be the case when the actual what would be built is residential. So let's create an opportunity where you take that piece of land, it's zoned for 30-story residential, you have 1 story of commercial property tax charges and 29 stories of residential tax.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mike?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Damon. I just wanted to clarify when you talked about 3.4 million square feet by 2024, what type of space is that?
So that's referring to our 2030 district, which is a public-private partnership in the Greater Victoria area. That's the amount of commercial real estate that has committed to achieving these the 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2007.
Okay. And if I may, with regards to retrofits, I assume that's part of the energy step code out of the BC Building Code?
It is, partly, yes.
And does that gives you 5 more years from what date?
Well, they're not, those are kind of 2 slightly different things. So the 2030 is a voluntary commitment that the participants in the 2030 district have made to reach those objectives by 2030. The BC step code is for everyone in the province. So it's not just for this subsection of buildings in Greater Victoria.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Damien. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for responding to the questions from the committee. This is important insights about buildings and commercial buildings. I know that my community in Burnaby faces some of these challenges as well, so I'm somewhat familiar with it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your suggestions.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Mike Leonard, BC Maritime Employers Association. So, Mike, you have 5 minutes to make your presentation. At 30 seconds to go, we will signal you so that you know it's time to wrap up, and then we'll follow with about 5 minutes of questions from the committee.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mike Leonard. I'm president of the BC Maritime Employers Association. I'd first like to acknowledge with respect that I'm meeting with you today on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Indigenous peoples are playing a significant role in BC's waterfront, and in fact, they're a large part of our future, especially in communities like Prince Rupert, where over 40% of our workforce is Indigenous. Our workforce is at the heart of what we do. They're world-class. They are known for their skill, their innovation and diversity, who proudly work in well-paying, family-supporting jobs that sustain many communities across BC. As the BC Maritime Employers, we are the Human Resources Department for BC's waterfront operators, representing 49 employers comprised of terminal operators, marine carriers, ship agents, who employ a workforce of more than 9,400 men and women across the province. Historically, we're known for labor relations and collective bargaining, but we're much more than that. We've got a deep expertise in training and safety, where safety is at the heart of what we do, and we spend $30 million every year to ensure our workforce is skilled and safe and productive in what they are dispatched to provide to waterfront employers across the province. Where ships meet shore, our members, along with our LW union partners, move about $500 million worth of cargo at BC ports every day. That represents 16% of Canada's total trade in goods on a daily basis. So from our perspective, our members are a vital part of BC and the Canadian economy, and they provide good-paying, family-supporting jobs up and down the BC coast. To put some context around that, the average waterfront job pays $110,000, which is nearly double the national and provincial average of similar of wages. Looking at that on a more specific basis, from a longshore and foreman perspective, respectively, they earn $120,000 and $214,000 annually as a group. Our membership is also a significant generator of taxation revenues, with approximately $400 million paid annually to all levels of government, and that's in addition to $204 million in fees and lease payments to port authorities across BC. So in summary, Canada's West Coast ports are critical to the economic and social well-being of British Columbia and Canada. I'm going to speak very briefly about the state of the waterfront. I think the one word that summarizes what we've experienced over the course of the last 20 months is dynamic and ever-changing. Globally and locally, Canadian supply chains have experienced increased turbulence and uncertainty, unlike anything that we've ever seen in recent memory. The past 20 months, we've experienced supply chain shocks from COVID-19 related shutdowns to rail disruptions due to labor disputes, climate change events, and protests. As most of you will recall, this summer, all rail service to Canada's largest port, the Port of Vancouver, was stopped for a number of days and further disrupted over a number of weeks following the disastrous and tragic fires in Lytton and the interior of BC. All things considered, I think our sector has weathered these shocks as well as could be expected and demonstrated that it's operationally resilient. I think in large part the success is attributed to the partnership that we have with Labour and that the collaborative approach we've taken with them has proven to prove quite effective in managing these unforeseen and challenging events. Moving forward, we expect the supply chain to continue to be challenged by these dynamic events, and we believe that it's critical that we continue to work together, have a collaborative approach, and take an innovative view in terms of how we try and solve these problems and challenges moving forward as a group. I'm briefly going to talk about our response to COVID-19. Since the threat of COVID-19 arrived in BC ports in early 2020, our members partnered with supply chain actors and innovated and adapted quickly to the dynamic challenges presented by the virus. We worked with our union partners to come up with processes and procedures to enable the continuing of work on the waterfront to move essential goods for Canadian trade. We implemented extensive protocols, both prevention and response, through cleaning in workplaces and equipment. We invested heavily in equipment to ensure physical distancing. We've taken other additional measures, some of them innovative, partnering with local breweries to produce hand sanitizer, which at the beginning of the pandemic was in short supply locally. We've also worked in collaboration with the LW to successfully advocate for priority access to vaccines for the LW workforce, who are the frontline workforce bringing trade and goods and services that are much needed, both medically and non-medical, to Canadians across the country. More recently, one of our members, Ceres Terminals, who is usually well known for running a world-class logistics operation at the Canada Place cruise facility, was redeployed to work in partnership with local health authorities in the BC government to provide staffing at 5 mass immunization sites throughout the Lower Mainland. So bottom line, from our perspective, we believe in partnerships wherever possible, and that approach has brought us to leading the response to COVID. In summary, by implementing these measures, and while we've successfully navigated this virus to date, in that there hasn't been any major outbreaks resulting in any shutdowns of operations, we continue to see periodic cases arise as we speak, and our experience is that they're primarily amongst the unvaccinated at this point. I'm going to talk about port competitiveness very briefly. All of these adaptations that have been made by the terminal operators have basically resulted in millions of dollars of unforeseen expenditures that have risen over the course of the last number of months. That's on top of a very competitive environment where U.S. employers and port authorities and terminal operators are vying for our business aggressively on both the east and the west coast of Canada. So they're going after our cargo. That's in addition to an avalanche of new costly regulatory measures that are coming from all levels of government: Canada Labour Code changes, introduction of paid personal leave days, Provincial Employers health tax, potentially 10 paid sick days coming out of the federal election. And this is in addition to the previously mentioned generous salary and benefits that we've negotiated with our labour partners over decades.
You're over time, so if you can wrap it up.
Sure. I'll just say, in and of themselves, each of these new policies have real merit and value. What we're asking is the government give due consideration to the speed at which these things are being introduced and the cumulative impact they're having on our ability to compete as an organization, as an industry, in terms of providing family-sustaining jobs moving forward into the future. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And I'll invite the committee now to ask you questions. Mike.
Thank you for your presentation. I think that we ran out of time there. So at the end of your presentation, you had said the speed in which these things come forward. Can you explain in further detail of what these things and what time frame would be more suitable?
Sure. So over the course of the last 20 months, during the course of a pandemic, we've had to address funding considerations as it related to personal leave days, which is $8 million. That's in addition to the $12 million that we paid for the provincial health employers tax. There's going to be another $25 million potentially arising out of this election process, with the Liberal government pledging to have sick days for the workforce. I believe that there's value in all of these things. They have merit. All we're saying and asking is that the timing for this is not the most optimum from a competitive perspective in our ability to compete. They're layering on additional costs at a time where we're sort of on the ropes with competition from the U.S. And it really speaks to the lack of an appreciation for the cumulative impact that's having on our ability to compete. What we would like to see is a more sustained effort on the government to reallocate targeted tax dollars to areas where infrastructure bottlenecks exist, in rail and road, for example. This government has a productive track record in working collaboratively with stakeholders in the private sector and the federal government on major infrastructure projects. That has served us well in the past, and we believe strongly that further efforts in that area would be productive and fruitful for our industry. I would like to take the opportunity to recognize the work that the Ministry of Finance has done and their collaboration with the industry on the review of the policy for the Ports Property Taxation Act.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, I'm hearing similar concerns from businesses. It's the death by 1,000 cuts, everything from increased corporate taxes, employer health tax, paid sick leave, increases to the minimum wage rate. All of these things certainly are valid initiatives by government, but it is destroying the competitive nature of BC. A question I have for you, how important is the U.S. exchange rate differential between Canada and the U.S., and how does that play into your competitiveness and concerns going forward? We did see a bit of strengthening with the Canadian dollar on the backs of the election slightly, but that's certainly, I would imagine probably one of the biggest concerns that keeps you guys awake at night, wondering what that exchange differential might be in the years ahead.
That's a great question. I think a great example of the fragility with that is Prince Rupert. I think a large proportion, upwards of 85 to 90% of the cargo transiting through that gateway is discretionary U.S.-bound cargo. Discretionary means that it doesn't have to come through this gateway. It can come through any other gateway, frankly speaking. So they have a number of things going for it. One is the exchange rate that helps, but also the workforce and the commitment of the employer group up there being productive and reliable in terms of the delivery of service for that cargo which is coming from Asia. Clearly, they are being a little bullish and robust in terms of plans to expand and introduce additional operations up there, but your point's well taken. There's a lot of volatility, and there's options. Vessels are able to go from coast to coast. There's supply chain changes with evolving from shifting trade patterns. So whereas the West Coast is going to continue to be used, we're seeing evidence of people using the Suez Canal and going through eastern ports to rail up and truck up cargo from the U.S. ports as opposed to coming through Canada's ports. So there's a number of competing considerations that need to be sort of factored in, but that's one of them for sure.
Is there one form of measure that you use to kind of gauge, I guess, the competitiveness of ports that are operating here in Canada or in BC compared to U.S. competition? Like, how do you make a determination on the competitiveness of BC?
There's a report that comes out of the U.S. It's an economic-based report that does a study of port operations globally speaking. It gives us sort of a benchmark in terms of where we sit. We're certainly not at the top, but we're not at the bottom. There's room for improvement, and that's through training opportunities, working collaboratively with labor, the deployment of innovation and technology, all of which have to come to bear in order to be competitive. I mean, this is a very capital-intense environment, very competitive environment, and again, as I said, vessels are shifting assets. They're not terminals that have bricks and mortar and concrete and iron bolted into the ground, for the lack of better words. So there's a lot of considerations going into the productivity number, but you're absolutely right. That is a very significant consideration.
Thank you.
Well, Mike, we're out of time and we're behind time, so I'm sorry. I'm going to have to wrap it up at this point. We have other presenters, but on behalf of the committee, I do want to thank you for your presentation and thank you for the work that you represent. Your presentation was very clear, and your answers to the questions further deepened our understanding. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Okay, we can now go to our next presenter, who is David Green. So, David, you have 5 minutes. We will give you a warning when you have 30 seconds left so that you know to wrap it up, and then we'll open it up for questions from the committee. I don't think you were here earlier when I said that I apologized for what may seem like distractions and the fact that there are empty seats. We had a medical emergency earlier this afternoon, and hence we've had to, all of us had to cope with that. But we are glad that you're here, and we're very interested in having you make a presentation, and you have our full attention.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is David Green. I was the chair of the BC expert panel on basic income. We reported to the government at the end of December after 2.5 years of work. Part of our mandate was to investigate the question, should BC rearrange its tax and transfer system centered around a basic income? Our answer to that was no. But another part of our mandate was to look into the system in general and ask where reforms might happen. And a big part of our report is 65 recommendations that are quite broad-ranging. They range from issues related to labor regulation to questions about essentially extended health benefits for low-income British Columbians to reforms to income assistance and disability assistance. Needless to say, anything that extensive comes with a price tag that's not insignificant. It's a lot less than a basic income, and we believe much more effective. But we're quite cognizant of the fiscal position the province is in right now, having done the necessary expenditures for COVID. And so our submission is essentially a set of steps that we view as a bridge from here to sort of aspirational goals that are laid out in the report. These are steps that we believe could be done within this budget cycle or the next budget cycle without big impacts on the budget, and yet be moves towards the goal of making British Columbia a more just society. They range from options that are ends in themselves. So one of them is a recommendation to have a poverty advocate located within the Human Rights Commissioner's office. The idea being that a truly just society has the opportunity for people not to be consulted just once when a policy is coming in, but on an ongoing basis that is based on a human rights approach, which is much like the approach in the National Housing Strategy that's been brought in by the federal government. Many of the rest of the sort of 11 recommendations or suggestions that we're making have to do with preliminary steps, first things that could be done as a move towards some of the bigger goals that we set out in the report. So, for example, as I'm sure everybody here knows, one of the biggest challenges facing this province and many other places is youth aging out of care. A lot of what's behind the report is a fair amount of data work. One of the most troubling and stunning facts to come out of it is that youth aging out of care amount to about 1,000 youth every year. So not a huge number, but they make up 15% of all deaths of people aged 30 and under. What we recommend in the report is a move to a system
that involves, among other things, a very robust set of well-resourced community organizations that provide them with a stable base of support and a stable base of attachment. The first step towards that in our mind is to actually then to start engaging with the community organizations and former youth in care to try to figure out best practice in this area. In fact, in this area, one of the key points here is that 60% of youth aging out of care are Indigenous. So this is, in fact, this move would be something that would be directly involving Indigenous communities and would obviously be directly related to reconciliation. One of the other points in this area is that while the government has made some serious and quite impressive moves forward in this area in the last few years, it's scattered all across the government. There should be, we argue, one point in government that is responsible for youth aging out of care, and at the moment that doesn't exist. Other recommendations include, or suggestions, I think is probably the better way to put it, is, as I said before, a move towards extended health benefits essentially for low-income British Columbians. Right now, you get those if you're on income assistance. You essentially lose them when you leave income assistance. The first recommendation would be a move towards dental benefits. This is something that is essential for people's self-respect. It's purely painful, obviously, also to not have this taken care of, and it's important for employment opportunities. A first step towards that can be simply starting to work on the administrative side and start to talk to dentists, who obviously are going to be big on the other side of this. One very direct thing that could be done literally without changing the the fiscal structure. The COB, which is a benefit delivered to families with children right now, is scaled out with income in a way so that it reaches way up the income distribution. And one of our recommendations is to have that reduction with income be more targeted so that you get a lot more bang for the buck in terms of poverty impacts without changing the total envelope going to that. And I'll stop there. Like, as I said, there's several more, but those are some of the highlights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So yes, now I'll invite the committee to ask you questions about your presentation. Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, David. It's your report that you gave us is nicely done. It's easy to read. But I get what you're after inside of here, and it's a great shopping list, so to speak, and it gives a good start for where we have to go down the road. And I think that what I didn't see inside of there was a number that you brought up right off the beginning that shocked me, and that's the 1,000 that age out of care. And what was the percentage of people under 30?
15%, 1.5. I mean, the numbers, when you go through that part of the report, and I mean, a lot of this is known by the people who work in this area quite well. Part of what we did was pull together the data. We've got a lot of quite good support and access to administrative data. The numbers down the line are just shocking from one end to the other for this group. This is a group where, in our minds, what sounds like a pretty sizable amount of money per youth, but not a really big number overall, because there's, like I said, only about 1,000 aging out of care each year, could make a really significant difference.
And if you don't mind, could you just tell me what portion of that was a representation of Indigenous people?
60%.
Okay. I just look at this. This is something that reflects early intervention in the nth degree. Thank you.
That's right. And I think the other point is the reconciliation point. I mean, there is a strong feeling, as far as I understand it, in the Indigenous community, these are the children who've been taken out of homes younger and now at age 19 are put on the street in some sense.
Ben.
Thanks, David. Lots of ideas and recommendations that have been well put together. So I don't see any kind of quantified costing or what these things are going to cost. So if I was looking, I think there's 11. You list the first steps, but if you were to quantify them in a costing point of view, so that the government could look at it over a period of time rather than just day one, this is what it's going to be. Obviously, there might be some significant offsets too. Have you got any? Was there any work done on that? And
So Thanks. Yeah, so in the report itself, every one of the recommendations that these tack into have a number next to them. Those numbers were developed with government in conjunction with the government. Yeah. So, but some of these specific steps we haven't tried to cost yet. The one that's costed here is a program that is a wraparound program for women and children fleeing domestic violence, which again builds on some pretty substantial changes that have been made, advances that have been made recently, but putting them together in one program, providing sort of what is essentially a basic income for at the first point when they flee the homes. And that price tag is $20 million, which is, in our minds, not a huge price tag for something that could make a big difference.
So the order that says you've got 11 steps here, they're in the order that you've kind of distilled it down to. And if we look at the full report, it'll have the...
I'm trying to figure out if they're in any order. Oh. They're roughly...
Well, it says 11 first steps.
No, there are 11 steps. It's like, I'm just saying that one is not necessarily way more important in our minds than 11. That's all I'm saying. But these are 11 steps that we see as, like I said, as a bridge towards the other bigger recommendations. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
Well, thank you, David. I think that we hear it all the time. It's the ounce of the prevention or the pound of cure, especially for these youth that are aging out. What is the cost of not doing anything? Are they not going to potentially participate in the workforce of British Columbia? Are they going to be on social assistance for their entire lives? The impact on our healthcare systems, all the rest of it. So, I certainly agree that there's an opportunity to do much, much more for this segment of the population. So thank you very much for your presentation.
No, you're welcome. There is actually, if you're interested, I can send it to you. I just don't have it at the tips of my fingers. We actually did exactly that exercise, costed what the impact, essentially taking the youth aging out of care, looking at the fact that they're much more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, much more likely to get income assistance, more likely to be in the health system in various ways. I just don't have that number, and I don't want to say a wrong number, but I'm happy to send you that number. It's big.
Yeah, I'd really like to see that. That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Ben, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Sorry, one other question. You said, thanks, David. You talked about the scattered ministry approach, and I know that happens in government, and you suggest recommending there should be a single place. And could you just restate what you said? What type of ministry would it be, or what would it encompass?
So it's a good question. I mean, we don't view ourselves as expert on this part. I mean, the one possibility is that it sticks with MCFD. That these children have been with MCFD up to the point of age 19. The other main possibility would SPDR. Did I get that right? I always get those in the wrong order. Which because they're actually the ones that pick up next, because over 30% of these young people at any month are in receipt of income assistance after age 19. Over 75% of them are in receipt of IA by the time they hit age 30. Sorry. So that's another ministry that would be a natural place to put it. Creating a whole new ministry, that sounds more expensive to me and a longer time frame. But at the moment, the problem is, there are good initiatives that are being done in different places. Just nobody is sort of the one place to go to in order to start creating the kind of community system that we're talking about.
Thanks, David.
I'd like to wrap up this portion of the session by thanking you for coming and sharing this with us. This is pretty big to try to pack into 10 minutes.
Right.
But if I understand correctly, what you're doing is you're tackling the whole issue of poverty by addressing the causes of poverty, so that people have the tools that they need and the supports they need to play a different role in society.
That's great.
Much more complicated than basic income, but one that, if I understand you correctly, treats the whole person.
That's correct.
Yes.
But so can I just say one more thing? The whole report and all of the research that's behind it is on a website called bcbasicincomepanel.ca. So, I mean, it's also been inside the government somewhere, so presumably you can all access it, but if you wanted to do it at your fingertips, you can do it quickly.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
And our final presenter for today is Daniel Fontaine, representing the Métis Nation of British Columbia.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to be the last presenter. So I've got to keep the energy high, so I'll do my best. I want to thank you all very much for the opportunity to present to you today. I am Daniel Fontaine, and I am both the CEO and also the Deputy Minister for the Métis Nation of BC. I come here on behalf of the Métis Nation British Columbia, our public service, our elected cabinet, and the 90,000 people who have either self-declared or have become citizens of our nation. I am a proud citizen of the Métis Nation myself as well. I'd like to start off with a bit of an interactive component and to kind of maybe get that energy up there. So here's the interactive component. If you wish to raise your hand, feel free. If you just want to answer the question in your mind and at the end of the survey, figure out where you got in the true or false, then feel free to do either one. So I'm going to ask a series of questions. They're true or false. I'll start off with the first one. 1/3 of the Indigenous population in British Columbia is Métis. True or false? Nanaimo was founded by a Métis leader named Joseph William McKay. True or false? The Yellowhead Highway was named after Pierre Bissonnette, a Métis trapper. True or false? And the last question, so you can see how well I did, is Ontario Premier Doug Ford provides more funding per capita to Métis people than BC Premier John Horgan. True or false? So you can add them all up, and the answer to the questions is all true. So all of those were true. So if you answered true to all of them, you get 100%. Métis have actually a very rich history in British Columbia, dating as far back as the 1700s. A lot of people don't know that, and I'm hopeful in the coming months and years ahead, the BC Legislature will become more attuned to the rich history and the culture of Métis people and our presence here in British Columbia. In the 2021 throne speech, the government of British Columbia committed, quote, to share decision-making and prosperity with the Indigenous peoples of BC, unquote, renewing commitments made in previous throne speeches. The 2020 throne speech specifically mentioned the adoption of the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, DRIPA, as a significant milestone in the reconciliation efforts of the BC government. And while the BC government has underlined their focus on Indigenous reconciliation in each throne speech since being elected, there have been very few, if any, specific mentions of reconciliation with Métis Nation of British Columbia. One instance where a specific reference was made of the Métis Nation of BC was in the 2018 throne speech, where, quote, Indigenous peoples, be they title-holding First Nations, Métis, Inuit, or those living on or off reserve must be involved in the decisions, programs, and policies that affect them, unquote. Further, in his 2016 report to the Government of Canada, a matter of national and constitutional import, a report of the Minister's Special Representative on Reconciliation with Métis, lawyer Tom Isaac, a nationally recognized authority on Aboriginal law, states, Métis rights, quote, is clear from the law to date that there is no hierarchy of Aboriginal rights within Section 35. Métis are distinct Aboriginal peoples with equal but unique Aboriginal rights as other Section 35 Aboriginal peoples, unquote. The 2022 Métis Nation British Columbia budget submission I'm giving you today is an opportunity for the BC government to make the first major concrete steps in advancing real reconciliation with the Métis in BC. The total amount requested in this budget submission is $100 million to support the much-needed programs and services of the Métis people in BC that they require from their government, a majority of which in this request is the acquisition of land. There's two key points of the submission I'd like to highlight. The first is on housing. Ensuring that Métis people have access to affordable housing and can age in place are key components of our housing strategy. We aim to implement programs that will assist and reduce the impact of homelessness of our citizenry. We just heard from the previous speaker how important that is. Unlike First Nations in British Columbia, the Métis Nation is not land-based. Our citizens are spread across the entire province, and require housing and homeless programs and services in all areas of BC. And it is a critical priority for MNBC and our government to begin acquiring land, as has been the case for other Métis governing members across Canada. 3 key strategic priorities for MNBC under housing is to obtain funding to purchase land for Métis housing developments, building the capacity of MNBC, with the ultimate goal of attaining eligibility for BC Housing and CMHC funding. We want to also establish a new Métis Housing Authority to administer Métis housing developments, and also to launch a Home Start program providing startup funds for Métis families, people moving into new accommodations to avoid or exit poverty by covering necessary expenses to furnish their new housing. This program would... Yes?
You're past your 5 minutes, but we have allotted another 5 minutes for questions.
Okay.
So I guess what I would say to my colleagues is let's let you...
I have about a minute. No,
okay.
Just, this is it. Okay. The program would focus on women, single parents, youth aging out of care, and seniors. And secondly, MNBC represents 38 Métis chartered communities. Those communities are the foundation of our government structure. Typically, a Métis chartered community has a board of directors, including a president, which is elected by their Métis citizens within their catchment area. Métis chartered communities are primarily volunteer-driven and do not receive any ongoing operational funding. The chartered communities serve as a local organization for the Métis in BC and deliver most of the community-level programs for MNBC. For many Métis people across BC, chartered communities are where they go first, not to our central government. And whether during the COVID pandemic, the heat wave, or during the catastrophic fires this season, our chartered communities have stepped up to the plate to provide much-needed support and should be applauded for all of that. However, there exists a lack of funding. Stable capacity funding for community administration and assistance and volunteer coordination, including office space for all communities to deliver community-driven programs and services exists. It is integral that we support our chartered communities with stable and consistent funding. And on that note, I want to thank you all for hearing me out and also for allowing me to present today and present to you our 2022 budget submission.
Thank you, Daniel. So I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions and give you a chance to elaborate some more. Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and Daniel, thank you for your presentation. You used a couple of phrases, but I'm not going to hog all the questions right now, but you said age in place. And can you describe what age in place would be in your presentation?
Sure. So aging in place, I'll give you an example of one of the programs that we run. It's Maniki. It's a Michif word for community. And so Maniki is a program that allows our elders to age in place. So many of them, in particular in rural British Columbia, I was just up at Kelly Lake. For those of you who don't know where Kelly Lake is, it's on the Alberta border, way up in the northeast. And Kelly Lake has many elders who have leaking roofs. They live in almost impoverished third world conditions. And our Maniki program allows them to apply for funding to get a new roof or to maybe get a furnace replaced or to get something to let them continue aging in place so that they don't have to move out of the community or move into a long-term care or assisted living setting. So we're trying our best to, with limited dollars, to allow people to age in place. And a lot of our housing programs and a lot of our housing investments relate specifically to that.
Thank you.
Hi, Daniel. Good to see you again. Just help us understand, you said that it's not a land-based First Nation, which I think we know that. I don't know about Kelly Lake, but how do you see, or how does the Métis First Nation see with land from the Crown? How does it see handling or using that? You talked about the Housing Authority, so I'd just like to understand the dynamics of how you see it being managed. Is it different than other First Nations, which I'm not certain that they're all the same either?
Yeah, they're all unique, as is the Métis Nation. So we have, the construct we have with our nation is because we're not in a tight geographical area of a small area like a reserve, we're spread across the province. We do have pockets where there's a higher density in places like Kelly Lake and up in the northeast and throughout the Kootenays and other areas in the Okanagan. So what we're doing as a nation is we are in the process now of purchasing land. So we've actually are right now in the process of purchasing about 7 or 8 pieces of land across the province of British Columbia. It's the first time we've been able to do that as a result of some federal funding. The strategy we have with that land is very similar, I think, to many First Nations, but first of all, it is being able to have a land base for our people, for our government. But when we purchase a land for housing, we look as well at building a daycare. We look at as well as a cultural gathering center. We look at a place where it'll be a center point, a bit of a hub or a community spot. So we have 7 different regions throughout. I said we had 38 communities, but there's 7 different regions in the province that those 38 communities fall in. Our strategy right now is to, at a minimum in the next 12 months, purchase land in each of those 7 regions. We will work with BC Housing and CMHC to build the housing. But where we build housing, we build childcare. Where we build childcare, we look to build community gathering centers. Where we have community gathering centers, like I said, for our chartered communities, we'll build office space so they have a place to actually have an office, have an administration. So that's kind of part of our strategy right now. And since we're starting from basically zero, and by about a year from now, we'll probably have 7 or 8 pieces of property around the province. It's a large strategy around that land accumulation and then building those nodes and centers for our communities.
So will it be fee simple?
No, it's a little bit different. So we will own it as a nation and run that. They will mainly be affordable housing projects. Yeah. We're targeting for, in particular, those with lower incomes. That's our, given the limited dollars we have and the limited ability we have to purchase. The initial wave is really on our government owning those properties and running them as projects for affordable housing for seniors. Some of them we're looking at having 4 and 3 bedrooms to allow families to move in and be able to actually have something that's affordable that they can reside in. So they're not fee simple at the moment. We're looking at different models, Ben. There's such a big need right now for affordable housing that I would love to be able to get in other larger development projects that are fee simple, but we have such a high priority on affordable housing that we need to prioritize that over the next 3 to 5 years.
Great.
Yeah. Hi, Greg.
Thank you. You mentioned, I think one of the first questions was 30% of Indigenous people in BC are Métis. What does that in sheer numbers?
Well, it's 90,000 people. In the latest StatsCan report indicated that they self-identified as Métis or were actual registered citizens. So I should clarify that we have our own registry with our own definition of who is Métis. That definition is consistent with all of the governing members of the Métis Nation across Canada, from Ontario west to British Columbia. Within our own registry, once you apply, you have to go through a genealogical process of verification. We have roughly 22,000 people now that have gone through that genealogical process. You'll see in the budget submission a big area that we want to focus on is trying to increase that number from 22 to 90,000. We would want all Métis people to be part of our citizenry. And when I was just up in the Northeast not long ago, I had the opportunity to meet with countless individuals who were self-identified, but oftentimes they couldn't even apply for citizenship because they didn't have the funding to get long-form birth certificates or the kind of paperwork that they need to apply. So we're trying to reduce that barrier.
Sure. I've got a bit of experience. My wife, Georgina, is 1/8 Cree, but of course not sufficient percentage enough to be recognized as First Nation in the province. And so Georgina and our 4 daughters are all registered and have gone through the genealogical, and it was a lot of work. It took Georgina quite a bit of time. Question for you. My understanding is that there was a federal court appeal that related to the ability for Métis to have hunting and fishing rights in Canada. Can you give us a bit of an update on where that is at?
Well, at the moment, the ability and it is very much a major issue for Métis hunters and fishers in the province of British Columbia. They're not properly recognized. That still has not had a lot of movement. Part of that is work that we're doing in the kind of the legal system and work that we have to do to prepare kind of our case as well as just a construct of the way the system has kind of operated. But it is a very significant and major issue for hunters and trappers and fishers in the province of British Columbia.
Was there not an initial ruling and the federal court or government appealed it, so it's going through appeal? Do we know when there's going to be a final resolution to that issue?
Well, my understanding is I believe there is an appeal that is out there, but there have been some rulings that have provided some rights. We have to clarify those rights with the Government of Canada within the context of British Columbia. But there are things that the province of British Columbia can do right now that actually will assist Métis hunters and trappers in that, for example, they have to pay license fees. We don't have the ability to grant licenses ourselves as a nation to Métis hunters. Those are the types of things that could be easily done, as they say, the low-hanging fruit. But there are the larger, bigger legal issues around title and rights and all those, and those are still all outstanding at the moment.
Great. Thank you.
I'm conscious of the time, but I see Lauren would like to ask a question.
All right. Thank you very much. I think I've met with Métis people in my community. It's amazing that I think we have about 700 Métis people in the Caribou area. And I think they're both frustrated and excited right now. This suggestion of these potentially low-cost housing units, I'm sure, would be very exciting for our area. You mentioned 7 regions. Can you just quickly give an idea of where those are?
Yeah, sure. So there are 7 regions. So Region 1 would be Vancouver Island. Mm-hmm. Region 2 is effectively the Lower Mainland through to about the Hope area. Region 3 is the South Okanagan. Region 4 would be the Kootenays. Region 5 would be kind of this center, north central. Region 6 would be the northwest area of the province of British Columbia, and the Region 7 is the northeast. So the one you're referring to, I think your community is in Region 5, if I remember correctly.
Right, thank you. And just real quickly, any idea of scope so how many units would you guys be thinking of?
Well, we're trying to, obviously, I'm sure you've heard this before, but it is working very much with municipalities in terms of what they'll allow us to build, but and also the size of the properties themselves. So it depends on the region. We can get a bigger bang for our buck in rural British Columbia, to be quite honest, so we're able to purchase a little bit more land. But typically, the housing projects will incorporate a 4 to 6 story building. And we're looking at a kind of, on the podium level would be the area for office, retail space, as well as childcare. And we are looking at one larger development in Region 2 in this Lower Mainland area, in the Surrey area. And that would be our government headquarters. That would include room for our General Assembly, our entire public service, housing, a cultural gathering center. That would be the largest of all the developments that we would build across British Columbia.
Thank you.
Mike, is that what you were? Oh. He was texting me about that very thing. Daniel, it's been a long day of presentations, and I think the committee is tired, but you have so engaged us in your ask of government, and what a great way to end this day. I know that you've really piqued my curiosity, my interest, and I want to find out more ways I can support you in what you're doing.
Wonderful. We're going to be doing some work on housing in your area soon too, so stay tuned.
Okay.
I'll keep you posted.
Okay, please do.
Sounds good.
Okay, so with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. All those in favor? The meeting adjourned. Thank you.